Next bill on the calendar for the day is House File number 2856. The clerk will report the bill.
House File number 2856, number 2 on the calendar for the day, an act relating to public safety, the second engrossment.
I recognize the member from Isanti. Representative Johnson B. To your bill.
Mr. Speaker, members, House File 2856, the Public Safety Supplemental Funding Bill. But before I describe the bill, I want to thank the staff that helped put this together. From House Research, I want to thank Jeff Diebold and Ben Johnson for the fantastic work they did. Fiscal Analyst John Waltz, Committee Administrator Mike Valou, Committee LA Jeremy Hansen, DFL researcher Laura Talkenholtz, GOP researcher Jason Rector, and committee page Emmett Hadeen. Without these people, we could not have put this bill together. They did a fabulous job, and I want to thank them. I also want to thank Representative Hillstrom as the minority lead. She did a fabulous job working with her members and working across the aisle to make sure things are done properly. And I want to thank all the committee members. We had some good discussions with a lot of bills, and a lot of the bills that ended up in this omnibus bill. But this bill generally focuses on the kids of Minnesota. We increased the penalties for those who are involved in child pornography, address people in authority that have sexual relationships with our students in our schools, making sure our school bus drivers are not sexual predators, and fully funding the guardian ad litem program per the OLA report to best protect the interests of the children in our court systems. Last year's omnibus bill included significant increases in the funding for public safety. This is a non-budget year, and we focused in areas where special consideration supported a request for more urgent and supplemental funding. In our appropriations, we have $182,000 going to a new management, to fund a case management system for stays of adjudications of registered sex offenders. In the district courts, we have $618,000 for the interlock program for repeat DUI offenders. The guardian ad litem program received $3,667,000, which was the Governor Dayton's request and what the OLA report said. We fully funded it. It's a program that has not had full funding probably since even before it was started. We also have $850,000 for additional staffing for the Board of Public Defenders dealing with the Representative Frankie's bill for driving and texting. Also with Representative Grossel's bills with stays of adjudications for sex offenders. Public safety also received some funding, $39,000 for a vulnerable adult working group to make sure that crimes against our vulnerable adults are reported properly and to find out what went wrong. We also, for 2019 and 2020, we funded a program for missing and murdered Indigenous women. This is a 2-year program. We felt it was important to have it 2 years because it's a serious issue and we want to get the results as quick as we can so we can actually act on this as soon as possible. Some of the bills that are in this, as I mentioned, is Representative Frankie's bill. We heard a lot of discussion and testimony about people driving and texting and getting involved in very serious car accidents, or I should say car crashes, injuring people and sometimes killing them. And the way the current law is, they could get charged with a careless or reckless driving. With this bill, we link texting and driving with the criminal vehicular operations to show that hopefully this will stop people from texting and driving, because it is a serious issue. We also have Representative Sarah Anderson's bill dealing with multiple thefts. What we're finding out is there's groups doing multiple misdemeanor thefts, and we're enhancing the penalty if they get caught 25 times doing misdemeanor thefts. It sounds like a lot, but these groups are doing it so much and getting caught so often that 25 times is nothing before it goes to a felony level. We've also have Representative Grossel's bill, increasing penalties for those involved in child pornography. We want to protect our kids. And I have mentioned Representative Kunesh-Podean's bill dealing with murdered and indigenous women. It's very serious what's happening there. It was to the point where I chaired some other committee who heard about this and asked that I hear this bill. Some of the other things we have in this bill is dealing with Representative Lesh for clarifications in tracking warrants, dealing with cell phones. We also have Representative Barr's bill dealing with modifying fifth-degree criminal sexual conduct, getting rid of the getting rid of the loophole in that offense. We also have Representative Zerwa's bill dealing with notification to home care providers of registered sex offenders. Representative Christian's bill for penalties for employees and contractors that have sexual relationships with our children and the students in our schools. We have one of my bills in here dealing with changing the penalty of assaulting a law enforcement officer. We have too much of that going on. And if somebody's going to assault a peace officer, that officer is generally has to fight for his life. But if he does not get injured, the penalty is not very high. We have Representative Grossel's bill, increasing the penalty for assaulting firefighters, EMT, and hospital personnel. Shortly after we had a hearing on this bill, in Anoka County, Oak Grove Township, 2 firefighters were working to put out a fire and were brutally assaulted for no reason whatsoever. We need to increase the penalties because these people are the ones putting their lives on the line to protect us, put out the fires, help us when we're involved in a car accident or any other type of emergency situation. That's just a few of the things in this bill. It is I believe it's a very good bill. Deals with a lot of different areas, but again, the main thing is to protect our children.
There is an amendment at the desk. The clerk will report the amendment.
Lucero moves to amend House File Number 2856. The second engrossment as follows. The amendment is coded A18-0858.
I recognize the author of the amendment, Representative Lucero, to your amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And the amendment before us contains two different provisions. Both of these provisions were two different bills that we heard in the committee, Public Safety Committee. The first one has to deal with artificial intelligence and machine learning algorithms. There should be a handout coming around. I'm hoping it's getting passed out. And the handout is titled, Artificial Intelligence is Killing the Uncanny Valley. This is an article that appeared in Wired magazine December of last year. And I'm going to draw members' attention to just a few lines. On the very first page, it talks about or makes reference to researchers from Berkeley University last year released a pair of videos, one of them having to deal with a horse that was walking behind a fence. And the second video was that horse having been transformed into a zebra. On page number 2 of the article, it speaks about the power of the growing power of machine learning algorithms, the ability to rewrite reality. The purpose of the article is to highlight the fact that technology, machine learning algorithms, and artificial intelligence continues to advance to be able to transform existing pictures, videos, and audio into a reality that never occurred. So members, why do we care about this topic? One of the lines here, it references that machine learning experts are synthesizing convincing audio from 1-minute samples of a person's voice using artificial intelligence and this technology. So right now, the ability to create a picture or a video or an audio recording of something that didn't happen creates the problem of digital misrepresentation. And the technology continues to advance whereby even with forensic analysis, it will not be able to be determined that that was a product of engineering. So as the technology will continue to advance, eventually these capabilities will be on at the fingertips of an app on a phone. And when the ability to create audio, to create video that cannot be forensically determined to be fake, it can lead to a whole host of misrepresentation for us as public officials or for the general public. Because we know the old phrase, a picture is worth 1,000 words. How do we defend against a picture or a video that portrays an event that never actually happened and can't be digitally, or I should say forensically, determined to be a fake? How do you speak against that? How do you defend yourself against that? So what the amendment seeks to do is get ahead of this and make it very clear that this is criminal. The second portion of the amendment having to do with unauthorized computer access. The best way I can describe this is using an analogy of the physical realm. In the physical realm, it's clearly understood the crime of burglary. Now, most of us have deadbolts on our front door. And if we lock the deadbolt, it is our clear intent that somebody cannot enter in the physical realm into your house unauthorized by breaking that security mechanism. It is also clearly understood in the physical realm that if you accidentally forget to lock your door, or if you leave the door open, or I'm sure some of you, as I have left the garage door open overnight. Come to find out the next morning the garage door was open and had been open all night long. The fact that the door is unlocked or opened, it is still a crime to enter in unauthorized. Now, in the digital space, there are security mechanisms like firewalls, encryption, passwords, etc. And it is clearly understood, current law makes it a crime to bypass that security mechanism. What this portion of the amendment seeks to do is to make it clear that in the absence of a security mechanism, it is also a crime to enter into an IT system, even though one hasn't bypassed a security mechanism. Now, these were heard in the Public Safety Committee, but the language as written needs further work, and I am thankful for the advice of Representative Hillstrom, Representative Pinto, and others that there is a group of prosecutors that is working on this language, and I plan to work on it in the interim here to come back next year. But these are important topics, members, that I wanted to throw out there, introduce you to, that we definitely need to address. So with that, members and Mr. Speaker, I withdraw the amendment.
Representative Lucero withdraws the 858 amendment. There is an amendment at the desk. The clerk will report the amendment.
Pinto moves to amend House File Number 2856. The second engrossment is as follows. The amendment is coded A38.
I recognize the member from Ramsey, Representative Pinto, to your amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So members, earlier we debated a provision that was targeted at the rights of those participating in protests at pipelines and at power plants. And this amendment is aimed at a provision in the Omnibus bill that targets other people who are protesting. Specifically, the provision that this amendment would delete would increase penalties for blocking access to freeways, to airports, and to transit. Members, we've heard this language before in a debate last year, and I'll try to be quick in discussing it now. But it seems to me, members, we cannot ignore the context within which this language is offered. This is part of a trend by Republicans around the country and certainly in our state. Bills that have been introduced in many states targeted at those who are exercising their free speech rights. And it's not just the bill we heard earlier, that pipeline bill, but also a bill that we heard in committee in 2017 that would have allowed governments to actually sue protesters for exercising their constitutional rights. There's a whole pattern of issues here. And it's no coincidence, members, that this trend of targeting dissent is coming about at the same time as there's a trend of people speaking up for their rights. Many of them Minnesotans of color, immigrants, people who feel dispossessed and who are recognizing and calling out the inequities that they see in our society, that exist in our society. And so, members, the thought in the bill is that increasing penalties will somehow act as a deterrent for those who are exercising their rights. And it seems to me, members, that those who are doing this are doing so in response to inequities that they feel. They're not running to the statute books and pulling them down and checking to see what the penalty is. It may, if anything, cause there to be more actions as people who are feeling that their own sense of injustice is increased on this, and certainly has the danger of, once again, as with the earlier language, chilling the speech of those who are exercising their rights. Because, members, criminal penalties are not fundamentally about deterrence. They're about deciding as a society how we want to penalize those who are breaking our laws. And of course, that is the power of protest that in fact does break the law. It's a statement that certain inequities are so unfair the person is willing to accept the consequences. We need to then have those consequences be commensurate with the conduct. So as a policymaker, as a prosecutor, I'm thinking about how to set those penalties in a way that's commensurate with the conduct. I prosecute domestic violence crimes. Some pretty significant abuse can be inflicted by a boyfriend, by a partner, and have that still qualify as a misdemeanor domestic assault. This would increase the penalty for this crime to a gross misdemeanor. And, I want to point out that we may think of particular kinds of protests, but this is far broader. This is targeting access to transit. And it's only some parts of blocking transportation, yet another sign that this is really aimed at speech and that it's not really about public safety. And I just want to point out, members, that I'm expecting that the Republican majority, is going to talk about things that this amendment, that language is not. That you're going to hear that you do not have the right to block highways. I'm envisioning Representative Zerwas. There we go. You do not have the right to block a highway, and if you think you do, you are wrong. Oh, there we go. All right. That's what this is not about. Not about that. That conduct is criminal. The question is, what level penalty do we assign to it? And do we pick out certain kinds of conduct, once again, as with the earlier language, that we're going to say, this we're going to have particular aim at. This we're going to particularly target because it seems to me, because we dislike the way in which it's going. We dislike the message that it's sending. You are also going to hear that this is about people being violent, throwing items at officers and injuring officers. Members, I work every day with heroic law enforcement officers who are hardworking, who are serving our community. Assaults on them are reprehensible. That's not what this is about either. This is not about that. You look at the language. Assaulting an officer is a separate thing, a crime. It should be punished as much as we can, and I can assure you in the office I work in, that certainly happens. This is not what that's about. There's no assaulting going on, none of the rest of this. This is simply a situation where there is this particular blocking of access. And then the question becomes, what happens then? And I'll point out, we heard no complaints from law enforcement, no complaints from the cities involved, that somehow the tools that they already have are insufficient. No testimony, no request. No, this is being pushed as part of this systematic agenda to punish those who are attempting to raise the inequities that they see. Members, I think that that is not the right approach. I'll point out that the original Tea Party back in the 1773, I think it was, that was about this civil disobedience. They deserve the penalties that they got, but they don't need to have the additional targeting that this does. And so members, I would urge you to support the amendment. Let's remove this language from the bill, and then let's focus on the crimes being committed and the penalties that we have. Thank you, members.
Discussion to the A38 amendment. The member from Sherburne, Representative Zerwas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members, Representative Pinto, your impression was close. Your impression was close. It didn't sound quite like me, but it was close. And it goes more like this. You might think you have a First Amendment right to pull your Buick across 3 lanes of traffic and block that traffic. You'd be wrong. You're confused. You don't have that First Amendment right. In fact, that's already a criminal act. And what this bill, the language in this bill would do is say that that activity, when you block a freeway, when you block access to an airport, when you march in front of a light rail train and put your arms in PVC pipe and handcuff each other together and then put bike locks around each other's necks to the fence, that activity is so dangerous that it deserves to have an extra criminal penalty, that the penalty deserves to be elevated. Now, members, my intent is not to belabor this point. We've had this debate on the House floor several times. You've either voted for this or voted against it on this House floor a few different times. And so we can continue the discussion if need be, but I don't feel a need to belabor the point. You do not have the right to block traffic. You do not have the right to block access to an airport. And the reality is, Representative Pinto, when individuals do block the freeway, when they do block the airport, what ends up happening is they create a scenario in an environment that is inherently dangerous. It's inherently dangerous for motorists, it is inherently dangerous for the protesters, and it's inherently dangerous for the police officers that are responding. And of course, the University of Minnesota police officer that suffered a fractured neck when a cinder block was dropped on his head is one example of that danger. We have multiple examples of injuries that occurred to law enforcement over that time. And then, of course, there's the financial implication. Over a 20-month period, we had over $5 million in expenses between the city of St. Paul, the city of Minneapolis, the city of Bloomington, the Minnesota State Patrol, and the Transit Police. And so we're talking a significant real impact on Minnesotans, where we believe, and we have voted in the past, that this type of activity deserves an elevation in the criminal penalty. Members, I won't belabor it any longer than that, but I would urge a no vote.
The member from Hennepin, Representative Dean R.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And again, we see this bill. It's not getting better. As a matter of fact, I think it's getting worse. But I would like to ask Representative Zerwas if he yield to a question.
He will yield. Representative Dean.
So, Representative Zerwas, shortly after Trayvon Martin was shot and killed in Florida, there were a bunch of protesters that actually worked with law enforcement. And law enforcement actually tried to make sure that what they were doing was safe. So they actually were involved in supervising the shutdown of I-35W in Minneapolis so that protesters could march on the street. And we know that when those things happen, it inconveniences a lot of comfortable people because, you know, life is pretty easy. And that's one of the intents of protests, is to really sort of inconvenience and make people a little bit uncomfortable. So in that given scenario, what would the sort of jurisdiction that would be ruling in that situation when you have one law enforcement agency actually helping to make sure that the facilitation of a protest is actually safe, not just only for the protesters, for others people. So if you could tell me how this would work with this in statute.
Representative Zerwas.
Well, Mr. Speaker, members, Representative Dean, absolutely nothing would change. There is still ultimate discretion with the police agency on whether or not arrests are effected. And then there's ultimate discretion on the charging agency on what charges are pursued. And so this takes no local control away whatsoever. In the instances where there isn't a kumbaya moment on the center of I-94, where, say, bottle rockets, barricades, mortar shells, and barricades are thrown, well, then there might be a different outcome, Representative Dean, and that's what this would be for.
Representative Dean.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, Representative Zerwas. So really what we're doing is we're actually creating a unlevel playing field, because we'll have some jurisdictions charging drastically, going beyond a misdemeanor to a gross misdemeanor with your legislation. And we'll have other jurisdictions that will actually be taking to task their role as protecting public safety, that there'll be no charges. So I understand what you're trying to do here. You're trying to, in theory, prevent people from protesting, but your bill isn't doing that. So if it's to prevent people from protesting, that's one thing. But if it's to punish them more because they're doing something we don't like, I think this bill actually does that. And I think that that's clearly the wrong way to do that. I think if we actually begin to realize that for many of these folks that are, disenfranchised, dispossessed, not in positions of making decisions relative to their own lives, that they go out and they protest to try to take notice. And I think that what you're doing here is really, in many ways, mean. And I don't say that lightly, because the collateral consequences of having a gross misdemeanor far exceeds the collateral consequences of someone who is charged and possibly convicted of a misdemeanor. So I would ask that folks support the Pinto Amendment, to remove this language from the public safety bill to make it a better bill. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The member from Hennepin, Representative Omar.
Thank you, Speaker. Would Representative Sarwas yield for a question?
He will yield. Representative Omar.
Representative Sarwas, I wanted to know how many of our city attorneys came to you and said the laws that they had were insufficient in charging protesters.
Representative Zerwas.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members, Representative Omar, I've heard from literally hundreds of Minnesotans throughout the last few years while I've been working on this. Hundreds and hundreds that have said, yes, the freeways are for vehicles. The access to the airport is important to my business, to my livelihood, and to the ability to make my flights. And God help us if an ambulance needs to get to a hospital when my child or my loved one is in the back and protesters have blocked the freeway. Hundreds of Minnesotans have contacted me, urging me to do anything that we can do to try to dissuade people from flowing onto the freeways and plugging up their ability to just live their lives. Now, in the course of all that constituent service and contacting Minnesotans from across the state, I did not solicit occupational information from each one of them, and so I wouldn't specifically be able to tell you how many prosecutors reached out in all of those contacts.
Representative Omar.
Thank you, Speaker. Thank you, Representative Sarwas, for not answering that question. Would you yield for another?
He will yield. Representative Omar.
I wonder, when the bill came to be heard in committee, how many of our cities showed up to testify about the burden of cost for these protesters?
Representative Zerwas.
Mr. Speaker, Representative Omar, members, I had several cities contact me. I had several police agencies contact me. And oddly enough, Representative Omar, all of them said, please, fight the good fight. Keep up the good work, but understand, in this political climate, we just can't be out in front on this one. And I understand that. I understand that. I watched the press conference when Betsy Hodges, the former mayor of Minneapolis, was booed off stage when she was trying to introduce the new police chief. I get the climate that some individuals are up against. And so I understand that there's less ability for some city officials to take a front seat on this issue. I, however, am fine with taking a front seat on this issue. I am fine with defending the fact that the freeway is for cars and the airports need to be open for people to get to and from their flights, and that the billion-dollar train ought to run. I'm fine with that.
Representative Omar.
Thank you again, Speaker, and thank you, Representative Sarwas, for not answering that question. The truth is, not one single city official, not one single attorney came to testify in committee when these bills were heard. Not one single city official, not one single law enforcement, not one single city attorneys have sent letters in support of this legislation. And former Mayor Hodges did not get booed off stage for introducing the new chief. So that isn't correct. And I just want to say that this spate of anti-protest bills isn't a coincidence. What you and Representative Smith are trying to do is the opposite of what we want representatives to be doing. We want representatives to be encouraging freedom of speech. We want them to ask and advocate for their constituents, to show up, raise their voices, and to awaken us from our complacency. What you are doing is stifling the freedom of speech. What you are doing is instilling fear in people so that they go away. I hope everyone that supports this bill understands that what you are supporting is a bill that is going to make our citizens afraid to come out and show their dissent. This country is built on people rebelling, people showing dissent, and people urging their government to do the right thing. That's why we encourage protest. That's why I encourage all of you to support Representative Pinto's amendment to get this poison bill out of the public safety omnibus bill so that those of us who might want to support it have the option to do that. Thank you.
The member from Stearns, Representative Howe.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. I'm going to start off by apologizing to the Public Safety Committee because you've heard this at least twice, but the rest of the members, you're going to hear this at least once. And I'm going to talk about the effect of what happened to my daughter on the day that they decided to protest. She was flying in from Denver. I could not get to the airport to pick her up because the protesters had blocked the access. So I texted her and told her, I called her and said, take the train, take the tram, the light rail, to Terminal 2. I'll meet you at Terminal 2. Great idea. She was all over that. And I waited at Terminal 2. I could get to the terminal. And I waited, and I waited. Come to find out, she couldn't get to the tram. She had to get escorted past the protesters to get to the tram. She got to the tram. She got over on the light rail to Terminal 2. The doors open, wall of protesters screaming at her again. She couldn't get off the train until she got escorted from there through the protesters and finally got to me. Representative Dean, you talked about fear. You should have been there to look in my daughter's eyes and seen the fear in her eyes. How she was shaking, trembling, and tears coming down. She was terrorized. Representative Omar, you talk about fear. You should have been there to see the fear. You talk about mean. They were mean, Representative Dean. No doubt about it. Their First Amendment rights ends where my daughter's rights begin. You do not have the right to terrorize anyone. And that's what was going on that day. They terrorized my daughter. And instead of trying to gain the support of my daughter for that, they actually lost all of her respect that day. So I tell you, folks, you can't do it that way. And that's what that's what this bill does. I get fired up every time I tell the story. I apologize to the Public Safety Committee for hearing it again, but that's why this is in the bill. You can't terrorize people to that point of breaking down in tears and shaking. It doesn't work. So members, vote no on the amendment. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The member from Sherburne, Representative Newberger.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, members. This has been quite a debate. Quite the debate. I want to thank Representative Zerwas for bringing this bill forward, and I'm a proud co-sponsor of it. Proud co-sponsor of it. We've heard this language being referred to as we need to awaken the people. This is poison. You're stifling speech. This is mean. Okay. Most of you know my background. Most of the folks at home don't. 30 years. 30 years I've spent in the back of an ambulance for an ambulance service that works for a level 1 trauma center. Level 1 means no matter how bad it is, that's where they go. If it's a train wreck of a patient, that's where they go. 70,000 calls a year. When I start an ambulance shift, I go into service at 9 o'clock in the morning. And I'm lucky if I can be out of the garage by 9:01 and not have a call. And it's not uncommon for me to do 16 calls a day. To say we're moving is an understatement. I serve North Minneapolis. 30 years in North Minneapolis. If you live there, I've probably been to your house. And that's not an understatement either. So let's come into the back of my ambulance for a minute. I'm going to take you there. I'm going to show you what it looks like. Because it's not a pretty place. And when people are protesting and they're shutting down freeways and they're shutting down critical access to transportation, do you know what that means? That means massive confusion. That means traffic jams like you cannot believe. And when you are trying to navigate through that, that means that you are being slowed down tremendously. An 8-minute ride from Ilion and West Broadway to Hennepin County should only take about 8 minutes. If you're going from Lyndale and West Broadway to North Memorial, 5 minutes. If you're going from Aldrich and Lowry, those streets sound familiar? I know them all by heart. If you're going from Aldrich and Lowry down to Abbott Northwestern, should take you about 12 minutes. But if you are in the middle of a protest logjam, it can be up to half an hour. And what does that mean? We have a saying in EMS, it's called time is brain. Your brain tissue can only go about 6 minutes without oxygen. And if you have someone in the back of your ambulance who's having a massive CVA where a blood clot breaks in their brain and part of their brain isn't getting oxygen and their brain is dying and they're vomiting and they're seizing and you got a family member up front who cannot believe this incredible nightmare that's unfolding before them, and you're trying to keep this person alive just to get them down to that level 1 trauma center. 8 minutes away, not anymore. I don't think it's funny. I don't think it's funny. Because I've been there time after time after time. How about your family member or your loved one who's having a heart attack? And all they need to do is get to a cardiac cath lab to get that blockage cleared. You know why? Because they're dead. They're in the back of your ambulance. They are dead. And if your machine, your Lucas machine, isn't keeping that heart moving, they're going to die. And if you don't get them to that cath lab, they're going to die. But you get them there. And they do miraculous things at Abbott Northwestern, at Hennepin County, at North Memorial, at all of those major hospitals. They can take these people and they can turn them around. But by God, if you're blocking the freeway because you've got an issue, I guess that's just more important. No, it's not. How about asthma? You know, when you take a deep breath, but you can't get it out? That's asthma. Those are the worst patients you can work. You get someone that's in full respiratory arrest. An asthmatic, God help you, because you got to squeeze the air in, and then you got to grab them by the chest, and you got to squeeze the air out. Try to keep them alive doing that. I have. How about these poor kids, these beautiful kids that shoot themselves up all over our service area, all over the metro? They're all full of holes. They got tiny little entrance wounds, giant exit wounds, and they're bleeding all over. What can you do? You get them to a level 1 trauma center. That's what you do. Try doing that in 8 minutes. Oh, someone's protesting. Guess we're not getting there. I guess that's more important. 3 times in my career, 3 times, I've had what's called a cord presentation. That's where a mom starts going into labor. And we show up, and the only thing that is presenting from the birth canal is a beating umbilical cord, because that's the first thing that came out. Do you know what the treatment for that is? You have to take your gloved hand and you have to insert it into the birth canal, and you've got to push that head off that cord. And you know how strong uterine muscles are during birth, the contraction phase. Any of you ladies that have had children know. Well, you know what you got to do? You got to push that head off of the cord so that baby doesn't die. Oh, I'm sorry, there's a traffic jam, and we're not going to get to the hospital. I guess that protest is more important. God, I can't believe this. Vote no.
The member from Hennepin, Representative Flanagan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in support of Representative Pinto's amendment. Last year about this time, I remember walking behind a mother who was crying out in pain. And that mother was Valerie Castile. And you know what? I'd do it again. And what breaks my heart about this legislation is that we're not taking the time to have deep and meaningful conversations with people who are literally crying out in the streets for justice because their sons and daughters are disposable. When we talk about this issue, I know that many of us are here because we deeply care about our fellow Minnesotans. We deeply care about their lives and well-being. So this particular piece of legislation seems misguided because we should be going to the people who are crying out and asking for justice and asking them, how do we work together? How do we solve this underlying issue where people are hurting and they are afraid to send their sons and daughters out into the streets? So as a mother, I answered that call for justice, and I walked behind Valerie Castile. And I would do it again every day because the tears of that mother shook me to my core. And I hope, colleagues, that we take a moment to truly listen to the cries for justice of people who may not look like you or me, because let's be honest, these issues come up when the folks who are walking through the streets, maybe people of color, maybe indigenous people who are crying for justice. Build a bridge, build relationships, listen to the cries of these people. Thank you, Representative Pinto, for your amendment.
The member from Dakota, Representative Garofalo.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. If you're like a majority of this body, you recognize we voted on this bill already, so I'd like a roll call on it again to remind people of how they voted on it last time.
Roll call being requested, and seeing 15 hands, there will be a roll call. Representative
Speaker,
Garofalo.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker and members, I don't get the DFL on this one. I don't know why you guys think that protests and dissent are the exclusive domain of progressive causes. If you're standing out on the freeway or closing an airport, I don't care if you're pro-life, pro-Second Amendment, if you're fighting for indigenous rights or racial justice, I don't give a rip. You're standing in the middle of the freeway. You're closing down an airport. It doesn't matter what the cause is. You're shutting down critical, important transportation corridors that affect commerce and save lives. So regardless of the cause, you guys are associating this criminal activity with the cause or the justice. It's irrelevant. We're not, if we had in the bill, if Representative Johnson's bill or Representative Zerwas's bill said, well, if you're advocating for progressive causes, then it's a heightened penalty. Well, yeah, you'd have a point there, all right? We're not saying that. We're saying don't shut down the freeways protesting. Don't shut down the airports. Don't shut down the trains. I don't get it, but if you guys want to keep talking about it, have at it.
The member from Hennepin, Representative Allen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The debate here, I don't think that the majority of people understand what this bill is. I mean, Representative Pinto got up and talked about the legal sort of ramifications of it and how it's not needed and how, but that sort of, that doesn't appeal, nobody listens. So, I mean, you can't, I'm not here to defend unlawful activity. Most of the protests are lawful. I just was at a protest a couple weekends ago. It was at the Hilton to protest Pawlenty speaking at the Family Council, and it was a drag dance party in the street. And so what we do, we got a permit, and the police were on one end, on the other end, blocked off traffic after everybody got into the event, and we had our dance party, drag dance party in the street. Peaceful. Under Minnesota law, nuisance is, almost every nuisance law in our statute is subject to the penalty, or it's subject to a misdemeanor penalty. There are exceptions, but I would like to know why you are singling out this type of nuisance for an enhanced penalty. Let's take a look at some of the other types of nuisance, unlawful activity that we are not subjecting to an increased penalty, a gross misdemeanor. I'll talk about one, nuisance. Unlawful use or possession of a dangerous weapon committed within the building. So why is this not subject to an enhanced penalty? Why is it not those who unlawfully use or possess a dangerous weapon? So we could have Representative Newberger or Representative May Quaid talk about victims of gun violence and how we should be preventing the unlawful use or possession of a dangerous weapon in a building, in any building, our schools, and let's have a graphic account of what gunshots do and how our first responders deal with gunshot wounds. And let's have Representative May Quaid talk about the victims of gun violence and their survivors. But we don't subject that to an enhanced gross misdemeanor penalty. That's why I'm voting against this. What do we categorize under Minnesota law as subject to a gross misdemeanor? Here's some examples. Dissemination of obscene materials, commercial dissemination of sexually explicit materials. We have some under the category of abortion, providing mechanisms or drugs that cause unlawful abortion. That's a gross misdemeanor. It's basically abortion, obscenity, and unlawful distribution of drugs. Those are the only types of nuisance violations that we subject to the penalty of gross misdemeanor. But somehow, an unlawful protest is subject to a higher penalty than unlawful use or possession of a dangerous weapon in a building or a school. We talk about, you said earlier, we said that we don't talk about the constitutionality of a law. Well, and we don't, in the sense that we're not the courts. We don't interpret the laws. We don't. But we should care about whether it's constitutional or not. We should look at the potential for it. We should at least consider it, given that if it's unconstitutional, there may be a lawsuit, we may have to pay some claim. When you thought that the treaties for Mille Lacs weren't enforceable, I think that cost the state about $10 million to defend that over a decade, even though there was a settlement on the table. So do we care if the statute is vague? Do we care that does it prevent somebody? How many of you get on the freeway, and there's somebody standing there panhandling for money? I mean, what if we have too many homeless people standing there blocking the entrance to the freeway? Does this statute cover that? When we get into the area when we have these sort of vague sort of statutes, we talk about higher principles. You laugh at us for talking about that this erodes democracy and free speech, but it also erodes the rule of law. So that if as I hear, it said, well, of course, we don't listen to our city attorneys, our county attorneys, our prosecutors, who are the ones that make the decisions whether they're going to prosecute prosecute trespass or nuisance violations. We listen to the public, who doesn't, it took me a while to understand what this bill is really about. And so it's inflammatory. We use words like terrorize. We use words, we put labels on those people. So then it doesn't become where we're governed by the rule of law. We're governed by what some people say, I know a crime when I see it. And so that is an egregious crime, the unlawful protest on the freeway or the airport, and that it's so egregious that it must be subject to a gross misdemeanor penalty. And then we move on to other constitutional issues. Does it have a discriminatory impact? Does it have a discriminatory purpose? Very difficult to discern that at this moment because we all hide behind a certain privilege. The privilege that we have is that nobody can question our motives in enacting a statute. So we have to wait until we see through statistics that more people of color, if prosecutors decide they are going to prosecute the nuisance and impose higher penalties, then we have to wait and see, will more people of color be impacted than or white people. But the courts will look at that. We don't have to look at that. Nobody can question it, whether we have a discriminatory intent in passing this bill. And at some point, though, it does get judged. And whether that's in public opinion or whether that's by the courts, but at some point, we have to answer to that. So how important is the rule of law here? Or is it more important to do something that appeals to the public? It serves, I don't know how many times this session, this legislature I've heard that this serves a good political purpose. I don't know how many times I've heard that. And, you know, it doesn't matter what the impact on communities of color, because that's them. I mean, so you take I just can't get this out of my head. This about this at the airport when the immigration travel ban. Now, if my niece, who is she's going to McAllister next year, had been in the same situation, she's 18. She probably started flying when she was young. I know that she would not have been afraid by the protest. It was probably a lawful protest. I don't recall there being a lot of people arrested or prosecuted. So her reaction would not have been fear. It would have been, she probably would have recognized somebody she knew there, or she would have understood, she would have, through whatever social media, she would have been aware of what was going on. She may have asked her dad about it or her mom about it. She may have asked her friends. She may have read something about it. But she would have tried to find out what it was all about. And then she probably would have went over there and joined them and not been afraid to do that. So that's the kind of sort of cultural sort of divide, the fear that to me underlies this bill. Primarily, it's about fear.
The member from Dakota, Representative May Quaid.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members, I'm going to say something that I've never said before. Representative Garofalo is right, partially. This isn't about progressive causes. We're not talking about this because this is somehow a DFL issue. This is an American issue. Our country is literally a protest. And this bill isn't actually about protesters. It's about us. And I want us to take a moment to recognize the awesome power, and by awesome I don't mean amazing, but I mean huge power, that we have been given by our constituents. And our Constitution protects protest so that people can protest us when we don't do our job. That was the point. That is the point of protest. So this isn't about who's protesting now. My father-in-law was the lead tractor of the tractorcades in the 80s. He drove a tractor 15 miles an hour on a highway, leading tons of other tractors, most definitely blocking traffic. And it's not about who's protesting now. I want us to take a bigger look at what is happening in this moment, in this era, because they will write about this era in the history books, where a president attempted to ban an entire religion of people from our country. And so people showed up to voice dissent. Yes, it was inconvenient for people who were going to the airport or trying to leave the airport. But people who live comfortably need to be inconvenienced to experience the fear and the terror that other people in this country are living by. It is so important that we make sure that we do not continue down a road of authoritarianism by literally identifying the types of protests that have happened in the last 2 years that we are not comfortable with and singling them out to elevate those types of protests as being more criminal. That is a huge abuse of our power. That is not our job. Our job is to make the laws and the policies that the people of this state live by, to listen to them, to respond to their demands, not create more ways to make the way that they voice their dissent illegal. That is not our job. This proposal by Representative Zerwas is not helpful to Minnesotans. It allows us to abuse the power in the way that people voice protest against us, against what we do. So members, I ask you to support Representative Pinto's amendment so that we can continue to do our work, and more importantly, our citizens have a way to communicate with us and not hide them away. Because it doesn't escape me that the ways in which they protest that are the most visible, where most people can see them, are the ones that are singled out to be more illegal. We should support this amendment. If you want to put this as a standalone bill, maybe we should move it through the legislature like that. We should not abuse our power in this way. And members, I ask you to support Representative Pinto's amendment.
The member from Ramsey, Representative Lesh.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members, today is May 1st. It's recognized internationally as a day to commemorate workers' rights, what workers have achieved and accomplished. I wanted to give you a list of just some of the things that workers have accomplished through their voices and dissent. In the UK, they have 52 weeks of maternity leave, 39 of which are paid. They have paid paternity leave. New fathers in Finland get 45 working days. In the EU standard, they have 20 paid holidays. In the Netherlands, there is 2 years of paid sick leave. Now, the reason they have those rights over there, and before you say, yeah, wow, look, they're sinking in the mires of socialism, their economy's dying, please visit those countries and tell me if their economy's dying. They're doing extremely well. But in those countries, it's said, as compared to the United States, where the people are afraid of the government, over there, the government is afraid of the people. And that's why they have their rights to see their kids after they're born, to make sure they're not thrown out of their job if they get sick. And this is all brought to them by the power and authority of protest and dissent. And that's for simply economic justice. We're not even approaching the basic social justice and freedoms. And before you also talk about, yeah, those countries are terrible, that you're not free over there. Well, I also have a statistic pull up on my computer here that shows that every single one of those countries is designated as more free than the United States of America. And you're probably saying to yourself, oh, what liberal rag does that come from, right? Oh, the Cato Institute, Human Freedom Index. Every single one of those countries is more free. And here, in opposing Representative Pinto's amendment, you're wanting the people to be afraid of their government instead of the other way around, which would make us more free. And you laugh at us for standing on our principles. Like Representative Allen so eloquently stated, you think this is cute because you've quoted out to us multiple times, yep, we know Black Lives Matter, polls at single digits in greater Minnesota, we're aware of that, okay. Why the heck would you put up such a stink about this? Well, we may not have a majority, but we do have principle, and we will always stand on that. Now, at the end of the day, if you're not fighting for simple economic rights, but you're fighting for human rights. I remind you of some of the things that were said about Rosa Parks. You know, I get it, okay, she's protesting, but she could have done this without shutting down the bus system in Montgomery, Alabama. She could have worked within the system. That would have been much less irritating to the people of Birmingham or to the people of the South. Mahatma Gandhi, who broke a list of British laws longer than your right arm to gain freedom for his people, marched to the sea to make salt. This guy pushed the limits way past what folks there in the powers that be are common decency. And when I speak of the powers that be, I'm talking about this body. I'm talking about the privileged. I'm talking about the people who are irritated because they have to take a detour to get to the doctor. And yes, I have been in my car with my pregnant wife and had to take a detour on our way to an emergency visit to the doctor. So I'm well aware of how irritating that can be. But I've also, and I don't think anyone else in this chamber can say this, have been arrested and held for a day on what were, in that country, espionage charges in Syria in 2006 for using a satellite phone, which is outlawed under very specific circumstances, unless you have very specific circumstances in the country of Syria under the Assad regime. I had all my stuff taken away. I know how they treat people in that country. I can tell you where that country ranks on Cato Institute's Human Freedom Index, and it's really bad. Okay, I can tell you that personally, and I also have the statistics on there to prove it. But the irritation that I hear from folks about an emergency medical condition, of potentially being in a situation someday where it might be scary, where you have to take longer to get to the hospital. I find the irony in that blistering, because remember when we brought up this bill last year? It was brought up in response to specific protests. Protests referenced by Representative Flanagan, because a man died. An innocent man died, and nothing was happening. He bled out while he was waiting for that emergency assistance, and nothing happened. So people took to the streets. So when I hear people talk about prospective someday, what might happen if they have to take a detour in response to an innocent man who actually died, who shouldn't have had to, I find the irony amazing. And I know that it irritates you. It irritates me too when I have to take a detour, or when I have to put up with people standing in my way when I want to get somewhere, probably more than most of you. But please keep in mind that when we stand on our principles over here, it's because of the very principle that I hear so many of you on the other side of the aisle talking about, the principles of freedom, the principles of making sure that our state and our nation do a little bit better on that Cato Institute Human Freedom Index than it currently is. And if you really thought about it, you would think more about those core principles of yours than you would about the irritation that you suffer when you read about something in the newspaper. Members, vote yes on the Pinto Amendment.
The member from Ramsey, Representative Moran.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I was sitting here, I was going to originally ask Representative Zerwas to rise for a question, but I don't really need to, because I think you already know that the current law doesn't allow folks to be on the highway, right? You just want to increase the penalty. So I want to ask you to rise, because I know you know that. But what I want to do for 1 minute here is take you through some history. So I'm going to read something about Dr. Martin Luther King on the Pettus Bridge, which was a highway. And I believe it's like 54 miles from Selma to Montgomery, Alabama. And I would think on that day that they did this like 3 times to try to make it from Selma to Montgomery. You know this history, right? And I'm sure the highway was shut down. Probably ambulance didn't get through. Probably people had a whatever, right? And so the Selma to Montgomery March was part of a series of civil rights protests that occurred in 1965 in Alabama. a southern state deeply entrenched, a southern state with deeply entrenched racist policies. Deeply entrenched policies. In March of that year, in an effort to register Black voters in the South, protesters marching a 54-mile route from Selma to the state capital of Montgomery were confronted with deadly violence from local authorities and white vigilante groups. As the world watched, the protesters, under the protection of the federalized National Guard's troop, finally achieved their goals, walking around the clock for 3 days to reach Montgomery. The historic march and Martin Luther King Jr. participation in it raised awareness of the difficulties faced by Black voters and the need for a National Voters' Rights Act. And so when people are marching in this 21st century, this is not a joke. This is no one playing games. This is no one trying to stop an emergency from happening. It is about justice. It is about fairness. It is about being present and having your voice and your presence and your life matter. That is what the protesters is trying to help raise awareness about, an injustice that we as African Americans has felt for way too long. For way too long. And so when we talk about fear, a fear of a daughter who had to take a bus from the airport, you know the fear that I have to take every time my Black young sons get up and leave out of my home, that I hope that they will return back safely? That's real fear. In St. Paul, fortunately, I and many in our community have a very good relationship with our police officers. I'm not saying it's perfect, but we've built relationships. You know, we have a great police chief, but that is not always the case, and that has not always been the case. So when an unarmed Black man, boy, loses his life, the fear of a young girl and a young boy who has lost their parents, or someone who has lost an uncle, a brother, a nephew, that's reality. That's reality. And I'm having a hard time trying to deal with all the hypotheticals about what could have happened. What could have happened? What may have happened? Let's talk from the place of what is happening here. And I think that is what is important. In this place, in this body, where policies create practices that have kept a community like mine down. And I understand why the rural community don't get this. I understand why you don't get this. I understand why folks back home is having a problem with people standing up and having to protest and get in the highway to bring attention to injustices. That is not happening to them, or from people who don't look like them. But this is the history of America. This is a history. And we're tired of our Black men being dispensable, of our uncles, our fathers, our cousins, our brothers, our nephews. These are real people with real lives. And if you have to become an inconvenience about that, well, just as Dr. King on that 54-mile journey, so be it. You become inconvenience, because we are inconvenienced all the time. All the time. And we have to navigate our way through this world. And so navigate your way from the airport to find a way to meet her dad. If that's the biggest challenge that she had to do, I only wish. Representative Newberger, I get a little disappointed when I hear, you know, as a first responder, an ambulance, you know, I get it, but to think that everybody on the north side have seen you, have had contact with, I don't know what you were saying there. I'm just trying to figure it out, but no, that is not true. And you made a lot of statements about trauma ones, you know, trauma center, getting to a hospital. You know how many black men and boys have died who never made it to a trauma center because they were shot dead in their place? People are tired and fed up of the injustices. They are like tired and fed up. And so when rural folks don't understand it, I get it. Because it's not you. It's not your life. It's not nothing you have to deal with. That's the reality that happens so much, so often in an urban core. That is what we have to deal with. And so when you look at this and say, well, you know, what if, what happened? Not one person showed up in a committee to testify. Not one law enforcement officer, not one. I'm going to make an assumption that, you know, maybe they planned this. Maybe they was in communication with the police who stopped the traffic, who can respect the right of individual to protest. Maybe that's why they didn't show up, because they knew what those protesters' job was and also what their job were. And that was to make sure that no one got hurt. Did anyone get hurt? I would say not. Besides someone, them agitators that come in from the outside. You know those outside folks that come in and mess stuff up? And throw bricks at police officers to make the whole thing look bad. So we stand up for this and we speak about this, not because it's a liberal issue. This is a human rights issue that we take very, very serious. Very serious. The right to protest is fundamentally part of our Constitution. And yes, some people will get inconvenienced. That's how we bring awareness to the injustices. Otherwise, you just stay in the comfort of your being and be oblivious to all the injustices going on with someone else. And so, it's my hope that the governor see this language and realize that this is more than about being on the highway, that not one police officer or anyone else came to testify in support of. And I hope that each one of you who look over here and say, you can't be on the highway, know that this is deeper than that. This is deeper than that. So I stand in support of Representative Pinto's amendment to this bill and say remove it. And I'm just hoping you guys can vote in support of. Thank you.
The member from Hennepin, Representative Pepin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would the author of the amendment yield for a question?
He will yield. Representative Pepin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Representative Pinto, is there anything in the bill that prevents protesters from protesting lawfully?
Representative Pinto.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Madam Majority Leader, I think I'm not the author of the language in the bill. I'm the author of the amendment to remove the language, but I am not aware of anything. This applies to unlawful actions, as far as I can see, in the language in the bill.
Representative Pepin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and Representative Pinto. I agree, and that's why many of the comments have been very confusing when folks have talked about some language in this bill preventing people from protesting. Would Representative Pinto yield for another question?
He will yield. Representative Pepin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Representative Pinto, you're a lawyer. You're very familiar with the First Amendment and the free speech clause. And I'm wondering, has the Supreme Court said that the ability to protest is absolute?
Representative Pepin. Excuse me, Representative Pinto.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Madam Majority Leader, Mr. Speaker, and Representative Pepin, the Supreme Court has certainly not said that. What the Supreme Court has talked about is this concept of chilling free speech, that when there's a targeting by government as free speech rights, even though maybe the core activity is in fact unlawful, the danger is that speech that is constitutionally protected, that is lawful, in fact can be chilled depending on how the restriction is drafted.
Representative Pepin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would Representative Pinto continue to yield?
He will yield. Representative Pepin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and Representative Pinto. Could you educate the members a little bit about what the Supreme Court said about time, place, and manner restrictions?
Representative Pinto.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative Pepin, I certainly haven't studied up that, haven't refreshed my memory about the exact details of that, but in general, my understanding is that there are certain that government can impose certain restrictions in time, place, and manner of certain First Amendment activities. Again, the danger is, though, that depending on how a law is crafted, the concern is that there's speech that can be constitutionally protected. It is constitutionally protected. In fact, may well be chilled, and people may find, it may be that speech people will not be participating in because of concerns that it may be captured unfairly and unconstitutionally. And that, as I think you're aware, is a significant part of Supreme Court jurisprudence on the First Amendment.
Representative Pepin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and Representative Pinto. And the reason I wanted to speak is because there's been a lot of confusion, I think, created over many of the comments. So I want to be very clear. There's nothing in the language of the bill, the Representative Zerwas language, that prevents anyone from lawfully protesting. People absolutely have the right to protest. No doubt. This does nothing to change that. But the Supreme Court has said, and for good reason, that when people protest, it has to be in certain places, and that the government can put limitations on. And why? Why would the government need to put limitations on? Well, for things like specifically regulating the flow of traffic, safeguarding the public, promoting order, things like that. Because what Representative Neuberger talked about and Representative Zerwas talked about is true, and it's something that we as lawmakers have to take seriously. Protesters have every right. They can protest on the Capitol every day of the week. You know this, Representative Pinto. There's nothing that prevents them from doing that. The Supreme Court has laid out 3 different forums for place restrictions. And traditional public forums are places that the protesters can protest anytime they want. But when you get to non-public forums like airports and to freeways, the Supreme Court has consistently ruled over the years that the government can place restrictions because it's not okay for people to protest and shut down freeways and airports because of things like Representative Neuberger said. When you shut down freeways, you're interfering with an ambulance's ability to come and rescue someone who might be dying of a heart attack or a stroke. He talked about, as 30 years of experience, about what that means. And I would certainly hope as lawmakers, you would not want to be the one interfering with somebody's ability to have their parents' lives saved or their child's life saved. Or even in an airport, you want to shut down an airport? You think that's okay? What if somebody's trying to get home to a dying child or a dying parent, and the reason is because of a protest that for some reason couldn't take place in the public forum that's acceptable and that the Supreme Court has ruled as a public place, traditional public forum, such as the Capitol, which makes sense because this is where the lawmakers are. So it makes perfect sense for them to protest here, and even on streets that aren't freeways, potentially. But when it's when it's blocking traffic from flowing, you are interfering with the flow of traffic, you're interfering with public safety, or you're interfering with order, and that is not acceptable. So I just want to be very clear that many of the speeches tonight talked about the ability for people to protest, and as Representative Pinto said, there's nothing in this bill that in any way prevents people from protesting. They should protest. We care about that. We want to make sure people are able to speak out in this country. But there's nothing unreasonable about us making sure they're doing it in a way that doesn't harm other people. So members, thank you for listening to me. I absolutely hope you vote against the Pinto Amendment.
The member from Hennepin, Representative Dabney.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. You know, members, one of the challenges that we face is when there's a proposal on the floor or in committee, such as Representative Pinto's amendment here, we appropriately focus on that proposal, that language, in isolation. But of course, our constituents don't live in that isolation, and neither do we, and neither should our decisions. The context that we're debating this in, the context that this proposal returns again this year, is one where the last several years have seen numerous attacks on the freedom of speech and the freedom of press. Think back to the violence proposed by then candidate, now President Trump, encouraging his supporters to attack those who disagreed with them, promising if they were arrested for assaulting someone who disagreed with them that he would pay their legal bills in an attempt to silence dissent against his candidacy. Think of the other incitements at those rallies. Remember the T-shirts? Rope, tree, journalist. Remember the video just last weekend from Michigan with the supporter from his rally verbally harassing and abusing the journalists who were there in an attempt to silence them. Remember the presidential tweets calling the free press in this country an enemy of the people and encouraging violence against them. Look across the country as we've seen other proposals from other legislatures to silence and intimidate and chill the freedom of speech, including going as far as proposals to indemnify drivers who run over protesters who are in front of them. This proposal in this bill is yet another attempt to chill the freedom of speech because, yes, we're afraid. We're afraid of the voices that are rising looking for justice. Members, our greatest responsibility, perhaps, is to hear not the voices represented by the good professionals who are here each and every day, who can afford the lobbyists and the postcard campaigns and the commercials on TV and the full-page ads. But perhaps our greatest responsibility is to hear the voices of those at the margins who most need to be heard. And proposals such as are in the bill are an attempt to take that fear of what they may say and what they may want different and push it further to the side. Make sure that we don't have to listen, that we don't have to hear, which is in fact exactly what we were sent here to do. Members, I hope we will all rise to that better nature of ourselves and of our responsibilities and recognize that protecting the freedom of speech for all Minnesotans, whether we agree with them or not, whether they scare us because they're different than us or not, whether they scare us because what they want just isn't the way it used to be. But we take a moment and we hear those voices, and in fact, we rise to the occasion and we welcome them to the table. Because Minnesota will be better with more democracy, not less. I urge you to vote yes on the Pinto Amendment. Thank you.
The member from Sherburne, Representative Zerwas.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members, I tried to say that we'd had this debate a couple times already. We've had it again, and I think it's good. I think it's a good discussion to have. I want to thank the members on the other side of the chamber for, I think, a very productive discussion. I think a very respectful discussion. Representative Allen, Representative Moran, Representative Mary Quaid, Representative Flanagan, Representative Dean, and Representative Pinto for kind of kicking off this discussion. I hear you. I hear you. And so what my ask is that you understand what my intentions are and what my true motivation is. And it truly, members, is public safety. Pedestrians do not mix with vehicle traffic at 50, 55, 60, or upwards of 70 miles an hour. It does not. Large crowds amped up surrounding individuals, blocking trains, blocking airports. That is a recipe for disaster. And we've seen across the country instances of violence. We've seen it here in our cities. Violence break out in our streets. We've seen police officers injured. We've seen protesters injured. We've seen near misses with vehicles and pedestrians. That's what this bill is about. I think in understanding what the bill is truly about is probably why on March 21st of this year, the governor said he supports a lot of this language. I don't question the governor's commitment to treating Minnesotans equitably. And I hope you don't question my commitment to treating Minnesotans equitably. Members, this bill says if you block a freeway, if you block access to an airport, or if you block the mass transit system, which is already against the law, it says if you do that, the criminal penalty, because of the inherent danger of that activity, the criminal penalty is increased. And I respect what Representative Dabney said about what other legislators in other states have put out for proposals. I'll tell you right now, Representative Dabney, that the minute I saw a report of an indemnity bill for motorists that would hit a protester, I immediately put out a press release that said, I oppose that. That is wrong. That is dumb. It's irresponsible. It's unsafe. My goal is to keep people off the freeway so nobody gets hit. Not to ever turn a blind eye or let someone get away with hitting a human being with a vehicle. That is the exact opposite of why I first came forward with this bill. And understand, members, we've seen freeway protests, yes, in response to tragic community police interactions. Absolutely. Inexcusable and horrific. We've also seen the freeway shut down because labor unions decided they wanted to shut it down. We saw the airport shut down because labor unions decided they wanted to shut it down. We had I-94 shut down because a group of Minnesotans decided the candidate they wanted to be elected president just didn't win. And so the reasons run the gamut, members, but the inherent danger is always present. And so, Representative Pinto, thank you for bringing this forward. I appreciate the discussion. Members, I would urge a no vote. Let's stick with the governor. Let's stick with the Minnesotans on this language.
The member from Ramsey, Representative Pinto.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, members, for the debate. A reminder that there's been no request from this for law enforcement, from cities, from hospitals, from the airport, from ambulance services. There's been no example of an ambulance that's been stopped in this situation. In fact, I think Representative Omar had previously shown a photo of crowds parting to allow an ambulance to pass on through. Courts, as they look at this, consider the context. The context is a series of bills, including Representative Zerwas's own bill, allowing cities to sue protesters and to sue people involved in terms of what they're doing. So members, courts consider the context. We need to consider the context. When you do, I feel certain that you'll vote green, and I urge you to do so. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
A roll call being requested. The clerk will take the roll on the amendment. Clerk will close the roll. There being 49 ayes and 75 nays, the A38 amendment is not adopted. There is an amendment at the desk. The clerk will report the amendment.
Hoppy moves to amend House File Number 2856. The second engrossment as follows, and the amendment is coded A40.
I recognize the member from Carver, Representative Hoppy, to your amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker and members, this amendment is a bill that I had this year that we were working on. I appreciate the work of the chairman in putting the bill in the committee, or putting the bill into his omnibus bill, but this isn't going to work out for this year. And I think we're going to talk to the folks at Legal Aid and the bankers and the credit unions again and work with the constituent that brought it to me. We're going to work on it in the interim and get it right and bring it back in January. I'd appreciate your support of removing this section of the bill.
Discussion to the amendment. Member from Hennepin, Representative Hillstrom.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. I would encourage you to support Representative Hoppy's amendment.
Any further discussion? Hearing no further discussion, all those in favor of the A40 amendment signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. The motion prevails. The amendment is adopted. Hillstrom offers the following amendment. The clerk will report the amendment.
Hillstrom moves to amend House Bill number 2856, the second engrossment, as amended as follows. The amendment is coded A41.
Recognize the member from Hennepin, Representative Hillstrom, to your amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. This is just a clarifying language to the DWI provision that says if it's double the legal limit or more, that it applies. I've worked with the chair, and there's no opposition to it.
The member from Isani, Representative Johnson, to the amendment.
Mr. Speaker, members, this is a good amendment, and I want to thank Representative Hillstrom for bringing this forward.
Any further discussion? Hearing no further discussion, all those in favor of adoption of the A41 amendment signify by saying aye. Those opposed, no. Motion prevails. The amendment is adopted. Representative Lesh offers the following amendment. The clerk will report the amendment.
Lesh moves to amend House File number 2856, the second engrossment, as amended as follows. The amendment is coded A45.
I recognize the member from Ramsey, Representative Lesh, to speak to the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this is Representative Pepin's bill put into amendment form. It was raised by Representative Pepin last week or the week before. After exhaustive testimony in the newly created Rules Subcommittee that discussed workplace harassment, and based on discussion from experts, is the most significant thing we could do to end workplace sexual harassment in Minnesota. The major piece that it does is it removes the requirement that the conduct be pervasive or severe in order to be actionable under the Minnesota Human Rights Act. We heard in the Civil Law Committee testimony of so many cases that were really bad, including rape, which was not found to be actionable under the Minnesota Human Rights Act because it was not pervasive. It happened once, so it was tossed out. It was not a workplace sexual harassment violation, which you think is pretty ridiculous, right? But there were countless examples like that one. And then the lawyers came in and argued against this. And they said, now I still like lawyers, don't get me wrong, my speech earlier stands. However, I'm going to rail against them on this one because there were lawyers that were testifying in support of this change as well. But when asked to provide examples of cases that had survived this nearly impossible standard, this impossibly high bar, they could come up with 10 cases since 1986. So if you think to yourself, wow, were there 10 instances that should have had a vetting in court of this since 1986, which, by the way, was the year I was a big fan of A Flock of Seagulls and REO Speedwagon, if any of you can remember that far back. But it's a long time ago. There were certainly many cases that should have been actionable, but these women who were harassed in the workplace were told, go home. The current standard that was plopped on top of Minnesota law by the federal courts is inadequate. And before you say removing this standard would take away any guardrails, I invite you to read the language of our existing statute. It says, any unwelcome sexual advances, requests for sexual favors, sexually motivated physical contact, or other verbal or physical conduct or communication of a sexual nature, and goes on to list it. Okay, this is half a page of criteria designating what is wrong. But the standard placed upon this by that was borrowed from the federal courts makes it impossible to get any actionable claim on that. I think it makes sense to do this. It was a brilliant idea to put forth, and I hope we can all get behind this and make sure that we end sexual harassment in the state of Minnesota. And Mr. Speaker, I'd ask for a roll call.
Roll call has been requested. Seeing 15 hands, there will be a roll call. Further discussion on the A45 amendment. The member from Hennepin, Representative Pepin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and members, and Representative Lesh for bringing this forward. I hope we also get a chance to bring this forward in a standalone bill. But I do appreciate you bringing this forward. Members, Representative Lesh is absolutely right. We had, as you know, we started a new subcommittee to deal with workplace safety and respect. And at the beginning of the session, the intent was to look at our own House internal policy and address some of the issues that we've had here. And we did make some changes that I'm very proud of. But one of the things that came forward was the folks that spoke, the expert witnesses, the employment law attorneys, and others that came forward, and they started talking about some of the cases, and I literally could not believe the high bar that was created not by any legislature, not by Congress, but by the courts. And the thing that's really strange is that we passed this in 1982. We passed the Human Rights Act on sexual harassment in 1982. It was signed by Governor Quee, and it put forward a whole bunch of standards. And 4 years later, in the Supreme Court case that Representative Lesh talked about, the court decided that in addition to meeting these other standards, we also have to have this severe or pervasive language. So I think somewhat, very sadly and kind of ironically, is that we're actually in a position in 2018 that is behind where we were in 1982. And I think it's our job as a legislature to fix that. And I'll just give a few examples. This comes up on the floor as a standalone. If I get the support from folks to do that, I'll talk about it more. But I just want to give you a couple of kind of general examples of what we're dealing with. In the Duncan case, there were 10 incidents of lewd behavior over a 3-year period, but the courts found that that wasn't severe or pervasive enough for it to be an actionable case. In LeGrand versus Arch, 3 instances did not meet the threshold, even though they were arguably more severe than the conduct in the case before. In Coppin versus City of Centerville, an employee who endured 2 to 3 sexually inappropriate comments every week for 14 months did not meet the threshold to survive summary judgment. In McMiller versus Metro, 3 instances involving unwelcome kissing, confinement, and assault by a supervisor. There was another case in 2017 in Minnesota that just came forward. It was a very vulgar case. I would rather maybe email you the details of that one, as I don't feel like sharing this with the public. It's too inappropriate. But the court did say, until our courts articulate a different standard under which workplace conduct must be evaluated, the conduct alleged in the present case, however objectionable, does not constitute pervasive hostile conduct that changes the terms of employment and exposes an employer to liability under the Minnesota Human Rights Act. So, members, I hope we get a chance to talk about this more later as well. I know that some have come forward with some concerns, and I'll try to work to address those. But the fact of the matter is, it is our job as a legislature to look at what we can do to fix this. And I think at the very least, we should go back to where we were in the intent that was created way back in 1982. So today I would ask for your vote. Thank you.
Further discussion. The member from Stearns, Representative Howe.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And members, I don't know anyone that can support this kind of conduct. I'll be the first to admit, if this happened to my wife or my daughter, we wouldn't need, there wouldn't be any prosecution under this. There'd be a prosecution under probably a murder charge from me. That's how I feel about sexual harassment. But I do have some concerns about this amendment. And if you read the bill and the amendment on line 1.17 to 1.18, that deals specifically with
paragraph A, clause 3. And paragraph A, clause 3 is the conduct or communication that has the purpose or effect of substantially interfering with the employment, the public accommodation, etc. My concern is nowhere in law right now does substantially interfering have a definition as it pertains to sexual harassment. Doesn't exist. You look that up, and it pertains, substantially interfering pertains to real estate law. We went to the staff attorneys, we went to the 6th floor, they agree there's no definition. The experts agree that testified in civil law agreed there's no definition. That's my concern. I think this puts in a precarious place because I think that this does need to happen. I think we do need to do something. My concern is this amendment is not ready. That's my concern. I believe we need to do something. My concern is we need to do some more work. I believe that the majority leader's working on finding those answers. I'm just concerned that we put this in here and it's had one hearing. We've heard a lot of testimony. My concern is on 1.13, and that's where I'll leave it. Thank you, members.
The member from Hennepin, Representative Anderson S.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would Representative Lesh yield?
He will yield. Representative Anderson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative Lesh, as I look at your amendment, can you tell me where in the bill I would find Minnesota Statute 363A.03?
Representative Lesh.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and Representative Anderson. I haven't poured through the entire bill, so no.
Representative Anderson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative Lesh, if you would yield again.
He will yield. Representative Anderson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative Lesh, can you tell me if there's any of the section of law that this is pertaining to? Is that part of this bill anywhere?
Representative Lesh.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Representative Anderson, I can't give you an answer for that.
Representative Anderson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative Lesh, I'll help you out. I looked through the bill title because that's where they list all the different provisions that you would have in the bill. And there isn't a 363A in the bill at all. In fact, there isn't anything in the 300 category that would apply to human rights. If you were to look on there, the closest you get is 388, and 388 in Minnesota statutes is counties, county officers, and regional authorities. So from the statute perspective, none of that is included in this bill that's on public safety. Just wanted to point that out to you.
Any further discussion? Seeing no further discussion, the clerk will take the roll on the amendment. The clerk will close the roll. There being 121 ayes and 4 nays, the motion prevails and the amendment is adopted. Representative Hillstrom offers the following amendment. The clerk will report it.
Hillstrom moves to amend House File Number 2856, the second engrossment as amended, and the amendment is coded A46.
Recognize the member from Hennepin, Representative Hillstrom, to introduce your amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. Members, this adds PTSD as a presumptive occupational disease for first responders due to the nature of their employment. Members, silence can be deadly in this area, and we know that from many articles that have appeared in the newspaper. The USA Today reports that while 46 officers were fatally shot last year, more than triple that, 140 committed suicide. Members, we also saw in the Star Tribune that the Minnesota firefighters grapple with this silent epidemic of PTSD, and research estimates that anywhere from 7 to 37% of firefighters have PTSD, and yet the culture of our first responders is silence, because any sign of getting treatment or seeking assistance is a sign of weakness. And so, members, I believe that this is the right thing to do. This bill is filled with protections for firefighters, nurses, and medical personnel, and this is one more thing we can do to assist our first responders. And so, Mr. Speaker, I would ask for a roll call.
Roll call has been requested. Seeing 15 hands, there will be a roll call. Representative Garofalo.
Mr. Speaker, I rise to a point of order.
Representative Garofalo, state your point of order.
Mr. Speaker, I rise to a point of order under House Rule 3.21, and I'm prepared to offer advice. Mr. Speaker, what Representative Hillstrom is offering, regardless of the merits of it, is a workers' compensation law and rule. That is clearly the jurisdiction of the House Job Growth, Energy Affordability Policy and Finance Committee. Certainly, Representative Hillstrom is within her rights to offer that as an amendment, but it would be better when that bill is on the floor on Thursday, not today. And so this clearly is not germane to the bill, to House File 2856, regardless of the substance of the underlying matter.
Representative Garofalo rises to a point of order under House Rules 3.21 that motions and propositions must be germane. Further advice, the member from Hennepin, Representative Hillstrom.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. Members, this is the Public Safety Omnibus Bill. In this bill, we deal with all sorts of protections for officers, enhancing penalties for folks who assault officers, firefighters, medical personnel, nurses. Those are in the bill. This is also the bill in which we deal with the state's crime bureau. There are provisions in this bill for that as well. And so, members, if not there, where this is the most important place that we can tell our first responders that we hear them, we hear the concerns that they have, and we care about their safety. So, members, Mr. Speaker, I would urge you to find the point of order not well taken. It certainly is equally as germane as the last amendment we took to this bill, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, advice.
Actually, members, having reviewed the amendment and the underlying bill, and upon taking the advice of Representative Garofalo and Hillstrom, I find the point of order well taken. Representative Hillstrom.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to appeal the ruling of the Speaker, Mr. Speaker, and I'd ask for a roll call.
Representative Hillstrom moves to appeal the ruling of the Speaker. Representative Hillstrom moves to appeal the ruling of the Speaker and requests a roll call. Seeing 15 hands, there will be a roll call. As a reminder, the question before the body is, shall the decision of the Speaker stand as the judgment of the House? A yes or green vote supports the ruling of the Speaker, a no or red vote goes against the ruling of the Speaker. Discussion on that motion. The member from Dakota, Representative Garofalo.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. And on a point of order on this appeal of the decision, obviously, the substance of the bill and the amendment is not what's relevant. It's whether it's germane to the bill that's before us. So it's not relevant that we have a cooperative workmen's compensation advisory task force where we have a strong tradition of having labor and management bring recommendations to the chamber before we make any changes to it. That issue is not relevant to the conversation. In addition, the fact that regardless of who is in control of the legislature, even when the DFL was in total control, they did not forward a single workman's comp advisory task force. They did not make any changes to the workman's comp without the workman's comp advisory task force recommendation. So that's totally irrelevant to the debate. Also, that's because we're not debating the underlying substance of the bill. We're not debating that. In addition, the fact that the Workmen's Comp Advisory Task Force did not forward this in their recommendations to the legislature and is not contained in Representative, I believe, Albright's workers' comp bill that has strong management and labor support, that is irrelevant to the conversation. What is relevant is this section of law doesn't go in this bill. If you want to offer the amendment, there'll be a bill later in session, you can do it too, but it is clearly not germane. And if you want to have consistency on germaneness rulings, something I think I have a little bit of credibility on, you should vote to defend the Speaker's ruling and be in favor of that. Thank you.
The member from Sherburne, Representative Zerwas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Advice.
It's actually just discussion on the motion to appeal the ruling of the Speaker, so just proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members, I think Representative Garofalo is right in his underlying theme of advice. It would not be part of the discussion to talk about that. This language talks about defending the police and firefighters within our communities that day in and day out go to work to serve and protect. It would be inappropriate at this time to discuss how, by not following through and sticking up for our firefighters, this provision has been in front of the Workmen's Comp Advisory Committee for over a year, and they've refused to take a vote. Members, it's not part of this debate to discuss how one of the deputies that I worked with at Anoka County ended his career after a battle with depression and PTSD by putting a gun in his mouth and crying and sobbing and begging for help. And then, after being found a diagnosis of PTSD, they said, prove it. Prove that your PTSD came from your job. Which fatal motor vehicle accident was it? Oh, you invested child sex crimes for the last 7 years? What child pedophilia case was the one? Which was the one that drove you to contemplating suicide? I guess it would be inappropriate to have that discussion tonight in the public safety bill. Members, this bill, my bill, that Representative Hillstrom is offering as an amendment, this is about doing what's right for our firefighters, our police officers, and our EMS providers. We need to do what's right. And if we can't have the discussion in the public safety bill, you bet we'll be having it on Thursday.
The member from Ramsey, Representative Pinto.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members, Representative Zerwas, it seems like we can have this discussion. It seems like it apparently is happening. What this language is about is standing up for first responders, for those who are serving our communities, and of course that is replete with references to that throughout the Omnibus Public Safety Bill. I want to remind members that we had a vote yesterday to uphold the ruling of the Speaker on an amendment offered by Representative Drazkowski. The underlying amendment had to do with the renter's credit, nothing to do with local government aid. Representative Drazkowski's amendment, secondary amendment, had to do with local government aid. The point was made, these both have to do with property taxes. So good enough, and the majority said, that's fine, close enough. There clearly is at least as much connection, if not more, between this amendment and the underlying bill as there was just yesterday when we all voted on this very similar point in that way. And we said collectively, those in the majority said, that's close enough, that qualifies as germane. So clearly, and especially with the comments made by Representative Garofalo, Representative Zerwas, there clearly is at least that much connection. So members, I would respectfully ask that you not uphold the ruling of the Speaker, and let's have the debate that apparently has already started. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The member from Hennepin, Representative Freiberg.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The touchstone on these germaneness questions is frequently whether or not the same section of statute, the same chapter of statute is being modified. This certainly is the public safety bill and not the workers' compensation bill as a general principle, but if you look on line 49.18 of the bill, it does reference section 176.178. That is the section that is from the chapter dealing with the workers' compensation statutes in Minnesota. This provision deals with fraud related to the workers' compensation system. It alters the penalty structure for that. So there is clearly a reference to the workers' compensation statutes in this bill, and I think this amendment is perfectly germane, particularly when you consider that that's in there. So members, I would encourage you not to uphold the ruling of the Speaker.
The member from Blue Earth, Representative Considine.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And while it may touch on the workers' comp, it also deals with the mental health of our first responders, and it is also a workforce issue for our firemen and our police. And I think we should overrule the Speaker on this particular issue so that we can open up the discussion. I have a couple of stories that I would like to talk about too. Thank you.
The member from Ramsey, Representative Mahoney.
Members, this is something that I did not expect to have to speak to today or this year or utter these words. I'll be voting to uphold the ruling of the Speaker because this amendment is not germane to this bill, because it is, for all of my time here, workers' comp has gone through, I'm not sure what to call it, but the Jobs Committee. It's hard for me. I have sat through, I'm not sure if I'm getting a little farther off track here, but I've sat through all the meetings in the Work Comp Advisory Council that we have dealt with this particular issue. I've heard the horror stories. I've had public safety members in my district harm themselves and attempt to harm their families. Maybe it's that I've been here too long. I don't know. But this is a system that has worked and kept huge fights off the House floor. And to force business and labor to come together, to agree, to compromise, something we so rarely do here on this floor. But in that council, they are forced to compromise or nothing gets done whatsoever. Maybe we should learn from that. This bill, on Thursday, there will be a jobs bill that comes up. And it will be germane to that particular bill, and we should have the long, arduous argument that day. Not on this bill. I'll be voting to uphold the rule of the Speaker.
The member from Hennepin, Representative Hillstrom.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. Members, as noted, Chapter 176 is referenced in this bill. This bill talks about protections of our first responders. On lines 45.9 is where the protections for firefighters and medical personnel start. I would encourage members to not uphold the ruling of the Speaker, allow us to have the debate on this bill. And members, this is one thing that we can do in a bipartisan manner to actually show our first responders that we all do respect the job that they do for Minnesotans.
The member from Scott, Representative Albright.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. No one disputes the import of making sure that those that protect us, whether that be a firefighter, a police officer, a first responder, or anyone else in the line of work that might suffer from a condition as dreadful as PTSD, is deserving of the right and proper treatment. Representative Mahoney and I serve on the WCAC, which is a commission led under DOLI, Department of Labor and Industry. This is probably one of the most important issues that the WCAC has undertaken in the last 2 years. I think by the remarks that Representative Mahoney has made and that I would concur with, it is not that we disagree with the import of moving forward, but the severity of the conditions and the importance of making sure that every person gets the proprietary treatment that they are so deserving of. We owe them the opportunity to get it right the first time. We're happy to have the conversation. The Commissioner and both Labor and Industry are having that conversation, and they continue to do so. But I would urge members to allow the process that has served us very, very well over many years to take that into consideration and do the work, the hard work, that they have enjoined themselves to for the benefit of those that we are elected to serve. I would urge a ruling to support the Speaker.
The member from Sherburne, Representative Newberger.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members, I rise to support the germaneness of this amendment. It is with the deepest respect, Mr. Speaker, that I have for you, but I can't side with you on this one. I look at my coworkers over the years. I could go on, I could tell you stories, but I'm not going to. Suffice to say, the one thing I will share is I've had 4 coworkers in my career who chose early retirement by taking their own lives. So for me not to speak in favor of this would be doing them a disservice. So I will regretfully be voting against you, Mr. Speaker. And with that, members, please vote your heart.
The member from Isanti, Representative Johnson.
Mr. Speaker, members, I'm one of the few people in this room that actually understand what's going on. I've been there. The things these officers, these firefighters, the emergency medical response teams see is horrible. I am going to uphold the Speaker's decision because I believe it's the right thing to do. Because the last thing we should ever do is politicize this commission. They work very well. They need to work together and work to compromise. If this legislature gets involved and changes that, that commission will never be the same. We do need to uphold the Speaker's decision.
Member from Hennepin, Representative Uglum.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This is a very, very serious subject. And, you know, in my former life as mayor, I got to know a lot of our cops and a lot of our firefighters up in the Anoka, Champlin area. And this is a real problem. It's a real problem that we have to address. And I certainly hope that we are going to address this in the jobs bill. I wouldn't mind doing it tonight. I know the hour is late, but it's something that has to be done. It's a very serious situation. Thank you.
Representative Quam.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. This is important, but this is also not the right place to do the due diligence. My wife spent over a decade on the first responders, and I don't know everything she went through because it was private information, and it's difficult what they go through. But to give this the appropriate attention, we need to do it through the committee process and not on the House floor after 10. So I'm going to uphold the Speaker's ruling on this and hope that we can take care of it with due diligence.
Representative Grossel.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. I'm going to uphold the Speaker's rule. Now, every one of you, I think, know that I've been shot in the line of duty. I've been poisoned in the line of duty. I've been attacked in the line of duty. And from what I understand, this bill is not complete, and I talked to the bill's author. There's more work to do. Representative Albright said it right. Let's do it right the first time. I've executed a lot of high-risk search warrants. Gone through the door first. When there's somebody on the other side saying, I'm going to shoot the first cop that comes through. Do you think I don't care about what all my fellow officers, firefighters, EMTs, medical personnel are facing? No, I do care. I do care. But I want it done right.
Members, as a reminder, the question before the body is, shall the decision of the Speaker stand as the judgment of the House? A yes or green vote supports the ruling of the Speaker. A no or red vote goes against the ruling of the Speaker. Seeing no further discussion, the clerk will take the roll on that question. Clerk will close the roll. There being 71 ayes and 54 nays, it is the judgment of the House that the decision of the Speaker shall stand. There is another Hillstrom amendment at the desk. The clerk will report the amendment.
Hillstrom moves to amend House File Number 2856, the second engrossment as amended. The amendment is coded A48.
I recognize the member from Hennepin, Representative Hillstrom, to introduce your amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. Representative Zerwas has a provision in this bill that lowers the interest rate that's paid in certain cases from 10% to 4%. And I've offered amendments to delete the entire section from the bill throughout the process and lost every single vote. And so rather than offering an amendment to delete the entire section, I thought maybe we could exempt out from the lowering of the interest rate when the person who is harmed is a vulnerable adult, a veteran, or someone serving in the armed services. And so, members, I would ask for your support to narrow what Representative Zerwas is doing to give extra protection to vulnerable adults, veterans, and people serving in the military. Mr. Speaker, I'd ask for a roll call.
Roll call has been requested. Seeing 15 hands, there will be a roll call. Discussion on that motion. The member from Sherburne, Representative Zerwas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. Members, this underlying language that Representative Hillstrom is moving to amend has been in the bill in the past. We've voted for it in the past. Understand that the trend nationwide, members, is to bring the prejudgment interest rate down towards reality and back in line with the norm. And so I'm passing out some information that talks about what the interest rate is in states across the country and what the trend has been. And members, the trend has been to lower the interest rate across the country. In state statute, our prejudgment interest rate is indexed after the T-bill, but then has a 10% minimum interest rate. Except, members, a few years ago, the legislature got a ton of pushback from government. Its cities and counties, its school districts said a 10% prejudgment interest rate is just way too high. It's not connected to reality. And so the legislature cut government a break and lowered the interest rate for government to 4%. What the language in the underlying bill does is set the prejudgment interest rate for everybody the same way we treat government. Representative Hillstrom is trying to carve out certain groups and individuals to give them what she apparently thinks is the fair interest rate. I think all Minnesotans should get that fair interest rate. And so I would urge you not to support the Hillstrom amendment.
Further discussion. The member from Ramsey, Representative Lesh.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members, I rise in support of the Hillstrom amendment. Members, all this back and forth, these monkey shines between corporate interests and those injured and the history of them, I don't think that folks care all that much about the history of it. And Representative Zerwas is right. You know, the cities came forward and wanted a lower interest, and they made that pitch successfully because they were cities. But keep this in mind, members. Here's who we're talking about in this amendment. We're talking about vulnerable adults, veterans, and military personnel whom a court has found were injured and somebody was responsible for that, for harming them. That's who you're talking about taking money away from, unless you approve the Hillstrom amendment. These are not people who have frivolous claims, frivolous lawsuits. These are not people who even have potentially legitimate claims. These are people who a court has found were wronged, that a jury has found were wronged. And how long do they have to wait to get what is rightfully theirs based on the decision of a court? And if you as a corporation or as a corporate defense firm can successfully drag that out, now you're saving money at the expense of vulnerable adults, veterans, and military personnel. Just think about that for a second. And think about whether the cities came to the legislature years ago to get a good deal, a cheaper rate for themselves too, is going to make any difference to any of your constituents who are vulnerable adults, veterans, or military personnel. Representative Hillstrom's amendment makes absolute sense, and I'd ask you to support it with a green vote.
Any further discussion? Seeing no further discussion, the clerk will take the roll on the amendment. There being 50 ayes and 76 nays, the motion does not prevail and the amendment is not adopted. Representative Dean offers the following amendment.
Dean R. moves to amend House File Number 2856, the second engrossment as amended. The amendment is coded A49.
I recognize the member from Hennepin, Representative Dean, to introduce your amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members. This is an amendment that will authorize and encourage the Department of Corrections to work with a couple nonprofits who provide critical services to families of those that are incarcerated. If you're on the Public Safety Committee, you've heard this. If you're on Transportation, you've heard this. For some of you on the floor, you may not be familiar with it. But these programs provide a critical service to, as I mentioned, families that have incarcerated loved ones. And, you know, one of the things I believe our goal in the Public Safety Committee is to assure safety in the public. And we know that one of the #1 indicators for someone who's been incarcerated when they come out to not reoffend is if they have visitation. And it's even more critical when they have visitation from family members and immediate family members. So there was not any funds available in the only $7 million that Chair Johnson has. So this is a very stripped down version, and I look forward to working with the commissioner, the individuals that run these critical transportation programs to make sure that family members are able to visit their loved ones. And I would hope that we would pass this and it would become part of the bill. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Recognize the member from Isanti, Representative Johnson.
Mr. Speaker, members, these bills came forward real late in the session. We're not able to have a hearing on them. And in the public safety bill, we do not have any grants. But if we did have any grants, I'm hesitant to earmark grants where they should go. They should go through the normal process. And the way this amendment is written, if there is any grant money, it earmarks where that grant money should go, and I don't think that is the proper way we should do that. I feel that the Department of Corrections, if there is any grants that they have for these programs, they should look at all the available programs and use it the best way that they feel necessary. I ask members not to support this amendment.
The member from Hennepin, Representative Carlson.
Mr. Speaker, members, I'd like to speak in support of the amendment. A version of this, before it was scaled down, was before the Ways and Means Committee the other night. And at that time, I spoke in favor of the amendment. Transportation for families that are in this situation is extremely difficult. The places in which we incarcerate people are not the easiest to get to for a lot of the families, and a lot of these families we're talking about are low income or moderate income at best, and so transportation is a huge issue. But if you want to help keep these families together, if you want to make sure that once people are released, they join their families and they get back into the mainstream. This is a good approach, one step in that direction, so I would encourage a yes vote on the amendment.
The member from Blue Earth, Representative Considine.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Again, if you want to support families and if you want to cut the crime rate, these are two excellent programs. The literature is extremely clear. If people bond with their children, they are much less likely to recidivate. If they have a place to go, if they have a connection with their family, they are less likely to return to crime. It's actually a no-brainer as far as trying to keep the crime rate down. They more than make up for the money that we would spend. Not to mention that as your promoting family values. Thank you.
Any further discussion? The member from Hennepin, Representative Dean.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and members. There's no earmark here. There's no money. This is a simple authorization and encouragement of the Department of Corrections to work with two programs, one that is targeting moms and their children, specifically at Shakopee Prison, the Unprisoned Project, and the other partnership would be with Piece of Hope, which currently the Department of Correction already is working with them. They're already working with them. So it's not like, you know, there's people clamoring at the door to provide these services to these families that are in need. And I would just hope that members that would vote in favor of this amendment so we can move on and keep trying to make sure that these families and their loved ones are able to be connected to increase public safety. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Seeing no further discussion, all those in favor of the adoption of the 849 amendment signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. No. The motion does not prevail. The amendment is not adopted. Representative Omar offers the following amendment.
Omar moves to amend House Bill number 2856, the second engrossment as amended, and the amendment is coded A55.
I recognize the member from Hennepin, Representative Omar, to introduce your amendment.
Thank you, Speaker. I moved to America 20-some years ago, and my family started out in the East Coast. And my older siblings and my father were looking for a place where we can build roots. And my siblings discovered that there was a great state that had a great education system, and that great state was Minnesota. So in the late 90s, we moved here so that I can get the best education available. And I did, and I went to school here and was able to get a really good education in Minneapolis. And then something interesting started happening. A lot of the generations that came after me started having many more struggles. And I see some of the struggles that my kids now that are in our schools are facing. And I see the children of many of my constituents and all of the other people that I have conversations with across the state, the kind of struggles that they're seeing in our schools. And just this week, we saw an article come out about the cuts a lot of our schools are facing. And the governor today called for an emergency funding to our schools because at least 59 school districts throughout Minnesota are facing budget shortfalls. And we know that from 2003 to 2012, funding to our schools has decreased. It's decreased by almost $2,000 per student. A lot of our school districts right now are making tough decisions. And the kind of decisions they're making is, can they afford to have the teachers that they have right now? Can they afford to have school support staff? Can they have mental health professionals? Can they afford to pay for school supplies? And many of them are finding the answers to be no, 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 no. And when we think about what this particular school levy is supposed to be, is supposed to provide funding to support the education of our kids. And I think about education funding and what it's supposed to be for. It's supposed to advance and contribute to the advancement of the education of our children. And so we give cities and counties and townships the opportunity to levy for school safety dollars. And we give them guidelines on what that money should be used for. And so some of those guidelines are they can pay for the cost of having crime prevention and drug abuse, student and staff safety. They can pay for the cost of licensed school counselors, licensed school nurses, licensed school social workers, all important things that we are not adding an extra funding for. They can also pay to any cost that's associated with school climate, with bullying and those kind of things that help create a better environment for our kids. Taxpayers also in most of our local jurisdictions pay for law enforcement. They pay for public safety. And it seems that our schools are already struggling with the amount of money that they have to go towards education. And that our taxpayers are already being asked to pay for law enforcement. So it doesn't make sense to me that we continue to ask taxpayers to pay for both. That once we ask them to support education, that we use all of that money to go towards getting the best education possible for our kids. And that the money that we've already allocated to law enforcement should be used for that. And that our schools should be contracting and getting the support from local law enforcement to provide the extra safety there, because they're already embedded in our communities. We are already paying for them as taxpayers. That seems like a very logical thing to me. So I think about my time working at the city of Minneapolis and looking over the contracts that we would do between our police department and our schools. And I think about how much money the schools would decide to put into that pot and how much money would come out of our law enforcement budget. And I think how many of our parents really didn't understand that they were paying twice. And I think about all of the discussions right now that are happening in Minneapolis and the kind of cuts our schools are facing. And I wonder if we are starting to have a conversation about law enforcement money going towards paying for that, and education money going towards fully paying for education. So I was gonna, have this debate and see this bill go forth and have you all take a vote on it. But then I realized that there were amendments to my amendment. And one of the amendments to my amendment sort of really takes the conversation to another level. So one of the amendments to my amendment says that if we get this bill passed, we should also have the Commissioner of Human Rights force the Commission of Human Rights not to enforce the terms of an agreement with a school district or a charter school related to discipline policies. Another amendment to my amendment says that 20% of the Department of Education funding should be allocated for law enforcement. These two amendments are very interesting to me.
Mr. Speaker.
And they make it so that this bill and the serious conversation that we should be having about education cannot take place. And so with that, I will be withdrawing my amendment. And I know, I hope that when we start to have conversations that are going to be about the kind of things that we say are a priority for us, like education or law enforcement, that we have a serious conversation. That we do not politicize or make a mockery of the discussion. And so my hope is going forward that we will be respectful of one another and have a debate that is worthy of the titles that we have. Thank you.
Representative Omar withdraws the A55 amendment. Can't see those numbers this time of night. There are no further amendments at the desk. The clerk will give the bill its third reading.
Third reading, House File Number 2856, as amended.
Third reading. Discussion on House File 2856 as amended for final passage. The member from Ramsey, Representative Kanesh Padeen.
Thank you, Speaker. It's late. I'll make this short, but I wanted to remind everybody that May is American Indian Month. It's the month when our American Indians choose to celebrate their history, their culture, and their long-lasting spirit. But the really sad part of being an American Indian, especially American Indian woman, is that 84% of Native American women have experienced violence in their lifetime, and 56% have experienced sexual violence. And on some of our reservations, Native American women are murdered at 10 times the national average. In this bill, in this whole omnibus bill, there's a very important bill, and it allows for the creation of a task force to study the historic endemic of missing and murdered Indigenous women. And I want to thank both Chair O'Driscoll for hearing this bill and Chair Johnson for hearing the bill in each of their committees. Those that were there to listen and witness it realize just how traumatic this whole situation is. The raw emotion, the stories that our Native American women came and told were real, they're honest, and they're happening today. And it's time that Minnesota takes a stand and addresses it. So I want to thank this legislature this year for agreeing to take care of this situation at this point. We don't really know how many Native women and girls have gone missing, and that's a really big part of our problem. House File 3375 is creating a task force on missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, and it builds on the efforts of advocates for Native American women who have long cared, comforted, and have worked tirelessly over the decades to reverse the struggles facing our ancestors, our grandmothers, our mothers, and our sisters. So May 5th is National Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women's Day. It's a day that we remember to take a moment to remember our lost sisters and mothers and grandmothers. And I would like to thank this legislature for taking the time to listen and supporting the efforts of our Native American women in our communities. And I hope that as time goes by, we can address these issues and eventually eliminate them. So thanks much.
The member from Ramsey, Representative Pinto.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members, I've been talking a lot today, and it's late, so my apologies. I'll try to get through this as quickly as I can. But there is a major absence from this bill that, that I feel needs to be noted, and that is the failure to take steps to prevent gun violence. Ironically, the public safety bill taking this really important step to keep the public safe and keep guns out of the hands of dangerous people. Members, we face an epidemic in our country, in our state. 30,000 Americans a year die from firearms, nearly 1,300 of them kids. That's 80 people every day. This is a rate that is way higher than the rest of the world, any country we might want to compare ourselves to. It really is unique. And there is much that is unique and great about our country, but the rate at which people die from guns is, I think we would all agree, not one of those things. Now, no one policy change would prevent every one of those deaths, but we could prevent some of them. And I want to point out that rate of death is not just happening in schools. There's a reason I did not speak on the school safety provisions, I think it was yesterday, whenever that was, recognizing this is happening not just in schools, but in restaurants, at the Waffle House, in movie theaters, at concert halls, church services, prayer circles, community colleges, think of all the places, and certainly in our own homes. And we have the tools to prevent at least some of these deaths. Tools that recognize that the vast majority of gun owners are responsible and law-abiding. They use firearms for hunting, for sport, for hobby, certainly for the protection of themselves, for their families, because they enjoy firearms. They are responsible and law-abiding. And the focus, members, needs to be keeping guns out of the hands of dangerous people, the kind that I prosecute in my work outside the legislature. So, members, I have two proposals that were advanced. One is to have the background checks, the criminal background checks that apply to most gun sales, be extended to all gun sales. That's all it does. Right now we have in most sales, the same check apply to all sales. The other bill allows family members or law enforcement to go to a court and bring solid evidence that somebody is a significant danger to themselves or to others, and have a court issue an order to temporarily take firearms out of that situation with many, many protective rights. Now, members, these are really reasonable. I think it should be clear to those in the chamber and anybody else who's up at this hour watching this. These have very, very broad support. I think members are aware of the Star Tribune poll just from last week showing 90% support for criminal background checks. Now, some of our districts, I'm looking at some of the members, the support is probably lower than 90% in your districts. But other members, that means the support is higher than 90% in your districts. And we need to keep in mind that this is extremely, extremely popular. It's in use in other states, currently in use and has been in years, both of these measures. Recently adopted in Florida after the shooting there. In Vermont, which has a history of upholding gun rights, respecting gun rights, and recognizing this is fully consistent with that. The Trump administration and the Justice Department under Attorney General Sessions, they are supportive of these measures and want states to adopt these extreme risk protection orders, those court orders that I referenced. And they're specifically offering to help states in setting these up. So these are very, very reasonable measures, members. Now, these bills, as I think you're aware, received hearings in public safety, and then they were tabled. The reason given at the time was that the committee was going to be hearing other bills on the same topic, and we want to consider all of them together. Well, the weeks passed, we didn't hear a single other bill, and eventually we tried to have them taken up again, and we were once again told that these bills were going to be kept on the table. So why is that? Why is that? Well, last week the speaker was asked by a reporter, how does something with 90% public support, according to the Star Tribune poll, not have support from the House? And the speaker responded logically, that's a good question for the folks on the committee. And so with respect, if I may, if Chair Johnson will yield, I'd like to ask him about these bills.
Just a reminder, members, under discussion right now is House File 2856. So if we could keep our discussion to that. Representative Johnson will yield. The member from Isanti, Representative Johnson, to the discussion on House File 2856.
Mr. Speaker, members, Public Safety Committee did hear actually two bills from Representative Pinto, and both bills ended up being tabled. We had some concerns about the bills, and with some of the questions that were brought, those legitimate concerns. And so one of the members made a motion to table the bills, and which was passed. At a later time, it was motioned to remove them from the table, but there's no amendments to those bills addressing the concerns that the members of the committee had. And so the bills were not heard again.
Representative Pinto on House File, discussion on House File 2856.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And so members, and thank you, Mr. Chair. This is the Omnibus Public Safety Bill for 2018. House File 2856 is. And Minnesotans are crying out in large numbers with loud voices saying three simple words: keep us safe. Keep us safe, yes, in our schools, but in all the other locations that I specified. And what I don't see in House File 2856 is any measures that meet the test of making sure that, as the Speaker referenced last week, help reduce putting guns in the hands of potentially dangerous criminals. That's the piece that we are looking for, that Minnesotans are calling out for. That's the piece that is not in House File 2856. I had hoped that by the time this bill came forward, we could have some movement in this. We could have members reflecting the needs, the concerns, the demands of their constituents, of those who are so worried about their children, about their families in this area. I understand the statement has been made that measures to reduce, the measures like these are effectively dead for the session. I hope, members, that that is not true. I recognize that House File 2856 does not contain these measures, but it's going to conference committee. And members, I very much hope that as it moves through conference committee and beyond, that we collectively, the Republican majority in particular, is listening to its constituents, listening to the people of Minnesota, who are demanding to be kept safe and demanding to have these really, really narrow, focused measures to help keep guns and dangerous people kept apart from one another. That's what we all should be trying to do. That's what I trust that we all are trying to do. And we can do that consistently with supporting the rights of those many responsible law-abiding gun owners. State after state after state around the country is doing that. They are getting that right. They're doing so in response to their own constituents, in response to situations in their states, saying that this needs to happen. Members, this needs to happen in our state as well. Our constituents are demanding that it happen, demanding that we take responsible steps. House File 2856 does not contain those steps. It is deeply disappointing to me, but I trust, members, that when Minnesotans are talking to us, we listen, and the Republican majority will listen as well. And when this comes back from conference, I sincerely hope that it contains measures being demanded by constituents. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, members.
The member from Washington, Representative Frankie.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members, I rise today. First point I'd like to make is I'd like to thank Chair Johnson for running a good committee this session. I'd also like to thank DFL lead Deb Hillstrom. Things have definitely been challenging, but we run a good committee in public safety, and I always like to tell people about the bipartisan effort we put forward. And if you look at our bill, the DFL to Republican provisions in here are almost balanced. A little high, of course, on the GOP side, but I'm very proud to be on this committee and proud of the work we've done this year. And I just want to thank Chair Johnson and the committee for including my provision, House File 2932, enhancing the penalties for expanding the criminal vehicular homicide statute when texting and driving. And I want to thank the committee for their support on that. And with that, I am going to vote green on this bill.
The member from Hennepin, Representative Pryor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I too want to rise and address what's not in the bill. And as Representative Pinto talked about, the two provisions that were put forward and are on the table right now, which in a very narrow and focused and deliberate way would make a difference. It would reduce the amount of gun violence that we have. We know that because other states that have passed it have shown that decrease. Now, this is my story. Don't worry, it's not that heavy. It's just a story. When I come here every morning, which was a long time ago, but I'll be back tomorrow morning, when I turn around the corner, I see this giant American flag waving in the breeze, and it's beautiful. It's over a car dealership, but it's beautiful. And it means a lot to me when I see that flag. And some days, that flag is at half-mast. And when I see that, it's always first thing in the morning, who died? And I have to think about who died and what tragedy we share. And when we share that tragedy, we put the flag at half-mast. Now we know when we talk about these 80 deaths a day, that that's a tragedy. And some of those people could have been saved. Some of those people could have been saved if we closed the loopholes that allow criminals to get guns, allows a criminal to go to a gun show and go to the table of a private dealer that doesn't do a background check. And that person gets a gun. And that person then uses that weapon. And that person could be a domestic abuser. That person could be, just somebody that wants to use that gun in an execution of a robbery. But they have those weapons. And in states where they've passed laws that close the loopholes, fewer of those deaths happen. Lives are saved. We'll never know the names of the people that didn't die. We only know the names of the people that do die. There's another case where we're talking about these red flags, where people that are dangerous can be identified by someone that lives in their household or by police officers. And there is a due process to take the weapons away from these dangerous people, people that are an imminent threat to either themselves or to others. And when we say that imminent threat to themselves or to others, we're also talking about suicides and deaths from suicides. And when we talk about farmers that have mental health issues and feel isolated and alone, and they have a gun in their house, those are deaths where we might be able to prevent, because the household member might know what's going on, and they might be able to go to the courts and get that temporary order to protect that person's lives. And we care about those people. We care about their deaths. And so that's why these two bills, in their narrow focuses that respect constitutional rights, make a difference. And when they're passed, they save lives. And when they're passed, I don't have to think about that flag flying at half-mast because of the tragedy of deaths that we could be preventing and we're not. And so I look at the flag in this chamber, and I'm proud that I get to sit here and look at those two flags in Minnesota. But until we take action to do something that's within our reach, to respect lives and respect rights, I have to think of flags at half-mast when I come around that corner in the morning. And I have to have that moment of silence to know that we lost somebody that we could have saved.
The member from Blue Earth, Representative Considine.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Chair Johnson, you just said that there were concerns expressed about those two bills. I will remind you that immediately after testimony that the motion was made to table. So there was actually no discussion about either one of those bills. So I'm at a loss as to when those concerns were expressed, and that when the motion came to take them off the table, there was also no discussion. So again, when was this expressed that there were concerns? We never heard them. No, there's no question there.
Any further discussion? The member from Hennepin, Representative Hillstrom.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. Members, we've had a great public safety team on the DFL side, and we have worked with many of the GOP members in an attempt to do right by public safety. Members, the governor's provisions, the governor's requests are not in the bill. The funding of the guardian ad litems made it in the bill, and that is a really important proposal for us to go forward with. But there's nothing in the bill about opioids. That is a serious crisis in Minnesota that we need to address, and that is not in the bill. The majority of concerns that you'll hear from our side are about what's not in the bill. All of the things that we could have done better to improve public safety in Minnesota. We offered some amendments, of course, that didn't make it in the bill, and we hope that between now and the time this bill comes back from conference, that those provisions will be improved, or that we have an opportunity on Thursday to take care of the PTSD provisions that we discussed but were not able to add to the public safety bill. Members, public safety is usually a bipartisan issue in this chamber, and more it's becoming partisan, and that is really unfortunate. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about a couple of the provisions that the governor put forward that are not in this bill, that I'm hoping that between now and the time that it comes back from conference, they can be addressed. There is nothing in the bill yet to deal with the increase in prison population. There was a request for population growth to the tune of $7.864 million. That is not in the bill, and we anticipate that that needs to be addressed. $710,000 for the expanded access to opioid treatments. I'm hoping that we see the addressing of this opioid epidemic either in this bill or in another one. The funding of the healthcare contract for the Department of Corrections. It is a constitutional requirement that we fund healthcare for the inmates that we hold in our care. Last year, the department was going out for a new contract, and so this body decided not to fund the healthcare contract and said, come back next year when you know the new amount. They ended up saving the state $3 million, but it wasn't put in the bill. So the bill originally was expected to be over $10 million. It came in at 7.9. So there should have been a savings. However, that's not funded in this bill. There are a number of policy provisions that are really good policy provisions. Representative Kunish-Podine, you did a really great job in presenting the task force on murdered and missing Indigenous women and members. So there are some really great policy provisions. But the governor made it very clear that he's not going to sign a bill with controversial policy provisions in the bill. And the amendment to take out the protest language didn't pass. So I'm hopeful that between now and the time this bill comes back from conference, this bill will only improve. Thank you.
The member from Hennepin, Representative Hortman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members, here we are debating the Omnibus Public Safety Bill in Minnesota in May of 2018. On February 14th, just 6 days before we convened this legislative session, a shooting took place in Parkland, Florida, where 17 lives were lost. Young people and other concerned citizens have raised their voices across the country. State legislatures across the country, under both Democratic and Republican control, are taking action, but not here in Minnesota. We should use this bill to make Minnesotans safer. There are good things in this bill, but something's missing. The Republican majority's public safety bill fails Minnesotans because there's no common sense gun violence prevention in it. The people of our state are crying out for action, and this bill fails them. The very first day we convened on February 20th, the Capitol was full of Minnesotans asking us to take action, and it has been packed again and again on many occasions with citizens making the request time and time again for us to take action. In contrast to the House Republicans, House Democrats have fought for progress. Representative Pinto moved for action on the second day we were in session. He has two eminently reasonable gun violence prevention bills, one on criminal background checks and one on gun violence prevention orders. Two simple, reasonable bills that would keep guns out of the hands of people who shouldn't have them. There is a gaping hole in this bill where those provisions should be. I cannot, in good conscience, vote for a bill that doesn't address the most pressing public safety issue of our time.
The member from Isanti, Representative Johnson.
Mr. Speaker, members, we had a real good debate tonight on this bill, and it is a good bill. Did everybody get what they wanted? Absolutely not. That's how things go here. We never always get what we want. Representative Pinto and Representative Pryor, I understand your concerns on that issue. But what was interesting last night yesterday after we got done debating on the floor, I made it home just in time to speak to a college class on government affairs. I got done presenting some of the stuff and I got time for questions. Now this bill deals with the number one question I got. The very first question. We need to do something with criminal sexual misconduct. This bill does that. Question number two, what are you doing to help make our schools safer? Our education bill does that. We have stuff in this bill dealing with that, dealing with making sure that our kids are not victims of sexual assault in their schools. This bill does that. They had a few other questions about government and how it works. But after 45 minutes of answering questions, I finally had to ask the students in that college a question. And these students range from 17 to about 30 years old. I finally asked them, is there anybody concerned about the current gun laws? And none of them said they were concerned. The Minnesota gun laws are very good. In fact, if you sell a firearm to somebody that is ineligible to buy a firearm, you've committed a gross misdemeanor. You've committed a crime. We have those protections in place now. So those issues are taken care of. But overall, this is a very good bill, and I do ask for a green vote from all the members. Thank you.
Seeing no further discussion, the clerk will take the roll on the bill. The clerk will close the roll. There being 92 ayes and 35 nays, the bill is passed as amended and its title agreed to. Without objection, we'll revert to messages from the Senate.
Message from the Senate, Mr. Speaker. I hereby announce the passage by the Senate of the following House file herewith returned as amended by the Senate, in which amendments to concurrence of the House is respectfully requested. House File Number 3755, an act relating to watercraft, and the message is signed Cal R. Ludeman, Secretary of the Senate. Hertaus moved that the House concur in the Senate amendments to House File Number 3755 and that the bill be repassed as amended by the Senate.
I recognize Representative Hertaus, who will explain the Senate amendments.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. And We've only got 40 minutes before the legislative day ends, so Representative Eklund and I can get this done in less than 40 minutes, so thank you. Just kidding, just kidding. It's time to go home. Mr. Speaker, Sophia's Law was passed last year and it was extended to take effect actually today, May 1st. And many of you may have seen on the news that the law took effect. In addition, it was a first law in the nation, and other states out east are starting to adopt our model legislation with regard to watercraft on the eastern seaboard as well. 2 weeks ago, we passed this through the House and it went to the Senate, but the day before the Senate heard the bill on the floor, we had a message from the boating manufacturers who had concerns about some of the language. And so we had a conference call with the American Boat and Yacht Council, with the manufacturers, with Representative Franson, and worked out some of the final details. And so, members, the language that was changed in the Senate, basically the inclusion of the term motorboat included also for recreational watercraft or water purposes. We also had clarification with regard to the placement of the carbon monoxide detectors. And with that, I would remain for any questions, but certainly would encourage you to concur and ask for a green vote.
Is there any discussion on the Senate amendments? There being no further discussion, all those in favor of the motion to concur with the Senate amendments say aye. Aye. Those opposed, nay. The motion prevails. The clerk will give the bill its third reading as amended by Senate.
House File Number 3755, at third reading as amended by the Senate.
Third reading as amended by Senate. Any further discussion? There being no further discussion, the clerk will take the roll on the bill. The clerk will close the roll. There being 127 ayes and 0 nays, the bill is repassed as amended by the Senate and its title agreed to. Announcements by the Speaker.
Announcement by the Speaker. A message from the Senate has been received requesting concurrence by the House to amendments adopted to the following House files. House File Number 817, 1975, and 3622.
Motions and resolutions. There are copies of the non-controversial motions at the House desk and online. If there's no objection, we'll take action on these motions first. Hearing no objection, the motions prevail. Announcements. The member from Martin, Representative Gunther.
I'll see if I can get the date right this time, Mr. Speaker. Tomorrow is the I-90 party, and we invite every one of you to show up from 5:30 till about 10. And we got good food for everyone. We're looking forward to your presence. Thank you.
Further announcements. The member from Ramsey, Representative Pinto.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members, tomorrow morning from 9 a.m. to 11 a.m. there will be presentations by, I think it's 5th and 6th grade students in the Rotunda from Open World Learning Community, presenting on some school projects they've done. So if you get a chance on the way into session to stop by, check out the projects, I know that they would really enjoy that. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Any further announcements? The member from Hennepin, Representative Pepin. Oh, my apologies. Representative Hortman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Because of the I-90 party, our caucus is canceled, so everybody can join Representative Gunther's party on time.
The member from Hennepin. Representative Drazkowski, announcements.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members, the Property Tax Committee meets tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock, room 10.
Any further announcements? popular announcements or unpopular announcements? The member from Hennepin, Representative Pepin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I move that when the House adjourns today, it adjourns until 10 a.m. Wednesday, May 2nd, 2018.
Representative Pepin moves that when the House adjourns today, it adjourns until 10 o'clock a.m. Wednesday, May 2nd, 2018. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. The motion prevails. Representative Pepin.
I move that the House do now adjourn.
Representative Pepin moves that the House do now adjourn. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. The motion prevails and the House stands adjourned until 10 o'clock a.m. Wednesday, May 2nd, 2018.